A cat with black fur was sitting on the roof of a building while it was raining. The cat looked at the night, rainy city. Drops of rain fell on the paved road and the roofs of low buildings. There was an announcement from the station that the heavy rain that began last night would continue for about a week. The Met Office has issued a yellow rainfall warning, which could be upgraded to red. Heavy drops of water fell on the tarpaulin outside the store where the lights were on. There was a sign on the door of the store saying it was open. It was a bookshop. The shop owner's hand was covered in white cloth gloves. He took a book with a brown cover from the shelf. The owner of the store was a young guy. He is the main character. He had black hair slicked down and light brown eyes. He was dressed in a formal suit. The main character stood near the cash register and said that because of the rain, he was afraid that there would be no visitors today again. His name was Lin Jai. He smiled and looked good-naturedly at the front door and said that someone might forget their umbrella and would be looking for a place to shelter from the rain. Lin Jai stood with his back to the front door and closed his eyes, smiling. He thought that he was a very good person. There was a lamp and a stack of books on the cash register table. The main character looked at the table on which there was a kettle and a cup of tea with a towel. He hoped that this small act of kindness and romance would bring him an income. However, after this he decided that he wanted to get more clients, because it would be great if visitors were impressed by his kindness and bought a couple of books. A huge full moon hung over the rainy and gloomy city. The blue light of the moon fell on the roofs of the buildings. The cold blade swung, and someone's blood poured out. A girl in a black cloak held a blade in her hands. A bald bandit stood behind her. The girl waved the blade, and the bandit's right hand was cut off. The girl had short black hair, elven pointed ears, and yellow eyes. She was dressed in white pants, and under her cloak she had a white shirt and corset. Another masked bandit ran towards the girl, and his accomplice threw 2 knives at her. The girl turned around worriedly and looked at them. She deftly dodged the blades, but one blade still wounded her. The girl attacked back. On her hands were black gloves with sharp claws. The chain launched by the girl hit the bandit right in the head, who threw knives at her. His accomplice looked at him in fear and shock, and a girl was already standing behind him. The girl's right palm clasped his head. The bandit sweated from tension. The girl's second hand approached the guy's face and jaw. The girl looked at him ominously and coldly, and then broke the bandit's neck. The guy fell dead on the wet paved road after the girl threw him away. She gritted her teeth and grabbed her thigh, which was bleeding profusely. Blood dripped onto the road, mixing with rainwater. The girl was glad that it was finally over. She had several broken ribs, but the girl thought it was nothing serious. She calmly looked at her bloody palm. The girl pressed a button on her blade, after which it closed. She understood that even with the effect of tainted blood, self-healing would take at least an hour, and it would be dangerous if she did not find shelter. She needed time. She slowly hobbled straight down the street, leaning on her blade, which had been turned into a cane. Behind her were the corpses of the defeated bandits. The girl looked tired and exhausted. Suddenly something caught her attention, and she turned her gaze to the side. There was a bookstore there with the lights on and an open sign hanging. She began to walk slowly towards the building. She realized that this was the only store open in this weather, but she didn't know whether it was a coincidence or a trap. The girl put her hand on her bloody stomach. She removed her hand and there appeared wounded skin under torn clothes. The girl frowned and tensed, realizing that she had no choice. She needed to hide as quickly as possible. She decided to take a chance and do it. She pushed the glass door of the bookstore open with her hand. As soon as the door opened, the bell rang to notify Lin Jai of this. The girl slowly entered the store, leaning on her cane. She took a step forward, clicking her big heel. The girl looked around the store, looking at the columns and large shelves filled to the brim with books. Lin Jai was sitting at the table, reading a book with a red cover. He looked up from reading and turned his head towards the girl. The main character closed the book and smiled friendly, greeting the visitor. He narrowed his eyes slightly, lowered his eyebrows, and said that it was not in vain that he had waited so long, because such a wonderful guest had come to him. He looked the girl up and down, noticing her ear with a gold earring and the torn suit on her chest. Lin Jai understood that this visitor was full of stories. The main character decided that he would have to use his selling skill, but after that he mentally grinned and decided that the chatting skill would be more suitable here. The girl approached his table, after which Lin Jai said that he had hot towels and offered to use them if he wanted to warm up. The girl noticed his words that he had been waiting for him for so long. It seemed suspicious to her that there was everything she might need here, and even in an ordinary bookstore. She looked at the towel intensely and thought that this was not just an accident, and she felt that the store owner knew something. The girl rubbed her face with a towel and thanked Lin Jai, saying that she did not need to warm up. She couldn't figure out which faction he was from. It could be the secret tower, whose symbol was a tall black tower, Or it could be the Society of Truth, whose symbol was a book with a cross. She conjured up an image in her head of a guy with red eyes and a knife in his hand, suggesting that the owner might be attending a Pueblo's party. She looked at Lin Jai suspiciously, imagining a dark aura behind him. The girl believed that this man could not just be the owner of a bookstore. She grabbed her cane tighter and asked Lin Jai if he just said that he was waiting for her. The main character smiled and looked at her from under his brows, holding out his hand to her. He answered her affirmatively and said that it was amazing how fate could sometimes bring two strangers together. Lin Jai turned his head to the right and said, smiling, that she seemed to be in a difficult situation. The main character decided to use psychological suggestion. The girl suddenly tensed, a drop of sweat flowing down her cheek. Words about problems do not carry any meaning in themselves. This is an ordinary psychological suggestion. She swallowed nervously and replied that he was right. As soon as a visitor relaxes and starts complaining, Mr. Lin Jai immediately begins to say pleasant and supportive things in order to quickly get closer to each other. Hearing the girl's words, the main character immediately looked at her with interest. The girl behaved carefully. She raised her hand and said that she had one unpleasant problem. She couldn't judge right now whether this guy was a friend or foe, so she agreed with his words in order to study his personality and goals. Lin Jai took the teapot in his hands, began to pour tea and sympathized with the girl. He looked at her knowingly as he poured the tea and asked if she had relationship problems. The main character smiled sweetly while talking to her. He used vague speech, and the point is that the meaning of his words should be so unclear as to leave room for maneuver for both himself and the interlocutor. The girl looked at Lin Jai worriedly, not understanding what he meant. She believed that either he was trying to confuse her, or he already knew about everything. The main character grabbed a white upholstered chair by the back. He pushed the chair back, placing his other hand behind his back, and suggested that she sit down and talk about it if she didn't mind. The girl stood a few meters away from him, holding a bloody towel in her hands. She sat down at the table, looking at Lin Jai with suspicion. She assumed that outsiders had become aware of the White Wolves uprising in such a short time. The girl believed that it could not be that he guessed all this by accident, only if he was not in control of the situation from the very beginning. She put her hand on a glass of hot tea and said that she had been betrayed. The girl looked at her reflection in the black tea. She stated that one guy was to blame for everything that happened. She picked up a cup of tea and began to bring it to her mouth. On her head was a pink creature with a large red eye. The magic mirror egg is the egg of a magical creature that can seduce the mind. Because of him, years of friendly communication fell victim to greed and lust for profit. Everything went so far that he used the forces of the organization to destroy former friends. The girl imagined in her head a lot of $100 bills falling down. After that, she imagined herself standing with her weapon in front of several unknown people in black robes. Hearing her story, Lin Jai was immediately surprised, thinking that this was a story about unhappy love. He was shocked by this drama, but now he understood where such problems came from. And now he needs to find the right medicine. The main character took a cup of tea by the handle and said that there are two sides to everything, and perhaps she experienced betrayal. But this does not mean that this will happen to everyone. The girl thought that he had known about everything for a long time, and at the first opportunity people would follow the lead of greed. According to the same scenario, sooner or later everything would be the same. She lowered her head and calmly said that the main character was right. The girl put tea on the table and said that this betrayal had cost her dearly and hurt her greatly, because she had already seen the ugliness of human nature, so what was the use of it? Lin Jai closed his eyes, placing his hand on his chin. He reflected that she had lost a lot and suffered a lot, and he realized that she must have suffered emotional trauma from the guy who cheated on her. And it is at this point that a master of eloquence like Lin Jai comes into play. The main character immediately became more serious and said that this had its advantages. He looked at her, raising his hand up, and said that now she knows what is real and what is not, and does not feel sorry for the people who brought her pain, even if she was close to them. He covered his face with his hand, but left his eyes visible. The girl looked at him with confusion, her mouth slightly open. She thought that he was trying to use her to develop some kind of plan against the hunters, and he was acting with cunning and grace while hating the hunters. She decided that this bookstore owner was a high-ranking dark magician. The girl lowered her shoulders and put her hands on the table. She asked what he thought she should do. He made a creepy look and said that since these are ordinary bad people, then she can take revenge on them. He used the skill of targeted advice, that is, to retain the visitor by making him a competent offer, taking into account all life circumstances, which were very different for the better from other offers. Lin Jai frowned and advised him not to be lenient with them. The girl was holding a cup of tea in her hands. She looked shocked and confused. The girl asked if she should turn away from them, saying that she was not mentally ready for this. Lin Jai didn't care that something wasn't going according to plan, because everything was almost ready and it was time to get down to business. He smiled slightly, the tip of his nose turning red. He put a book on the table and said that it might be useful to her. The girl looked at the book in confusion. Lin Jai kept his hand on the black book, thinking that he was just reading the confession, and this difficult book is ideal for such a confused girl. The cover of the book had red moldings that resembled tentacles, and in the middle was a yellow eye. The girl tensed. Sweat began to flow down her face. She had not heard of this book called Blood and the Beast, and did not understand why the main character decided to give her the book now. She opened a book, inside of which were red magical texts. Suddenly the pages of the book began to fill with blood, which bubbled and flowed down. Sharp fangs appeared from the rivers of blood, and the blood itself poured onto the girl, who did not understand what was happening. The whole room began to fill with scarlet blood. Suddenly, red slippery tentacles appeared and wrapped around the girl's naked body. She looked confused and embarrassed. An image of a white, predatory werewolf with glowing eyes appeared. The girl suggested that this was a transformation into a beast. A huge blue eye appeared above the cup of tea, blood from which poured directly into the cup. The girl looked at what was happening in shock. She abruptly closed the black book with red stucco. Transformation into a beast is a power gained and controlled by blood. Hunters gain their power from fantasy beasts by injecting themselves with dangerous, tainted blood. She imagined the menacing face of a wolf beast and a syringe with a sharp needle. The girl was trembling with fear. She pressed the book to her chest. The higher the concentration of tainted blood, the greater the hunter's power and the stronger the transformation into a beast, which ultimately leads to death. However, this man has come up with a way to control the tainted blood. This is enough to undermine the entire system of power on which the hunting community relies. The girl turned her head worriedly and tensely. She looked at the main character and fearfully asked if this is what he wants her to do. Lin Jai stood up from his chair and put his hand on the table, answering in the affirmative. He said he needed her to do it, not for the sake of repentance, but to be honest with herself. The main character narrowed his eyes slightly and smiled faintly, thinking that even if a broken woman looks strong, in reality she is still sad. He looked at the girl who was shaking and struggling to hold back her tears. He thought that just a few words of comfort and a recommendation for a good book had already brought her to the verge of tears. Lin Jai placed his white-gloved hand on the girl's shoulder, deciding to use the original text from the book to instill confidence in her. He calmly looked at her, hugging her, and said that the trumpets would sound, signaling the beginning of the day of judgment, and he would appear before the Almighty Judge with this book in his hands. In his other hand he held a classic red edition of the Confession, authored by Russo. The main character rose above the girl and a blue aura appeared around her. He continued quoting the book as book pages floated around. On one of the pages it was written, "With the same frankness with which I talk about good and evil." Lin Jai began to lift the cup from the table and raised his hand up, saying that every person has the most base animal desires. He mentally asked not to worry, because he knows how to calm people down. The main character looked at her from under his brows and told her to come to terms with it and believe him, and she would start a new life. He used the last skill, the final conclusion. After the visitor has expressed his views, he needs to be given positive instructions as well as self-confidence so that he can take action and solve the problems he faces. The girl pursed her lips and was very worried. She couldn't answer. Lin Jai imagined himself as a teacher who stood near the blackboard and gave a lesson in eloquence. The main character raised his cup of tea and closed his eyes, smiling, and offered to drink to a completely new future. The girl, smiling, clinked cups with him and thanked him for his help, promising to follow his advice. She lifted the cup with one movement of her hand and drank the tea while Lin Jai looked at her awkwardly. He closed his eyes and lowered his head in embarrassment because there was boiling water in her cup. But she really drank it, and he just wanted to warm her up from the inside. He looked at the girl and realized that something was wrong, thinking that this was the power of the legendary skeleton. The main character took out a card with a beautiful design and put it on the table, asking the girl to fill out the library card. The girl pursed her lips, worried for some reason. The card included the date the book was picked up, the title of the book, and the name of the visitor. The girl left her signature, by which her name could be recognized. Her name was Jai Jixu. Lin Jai looked at the card thoughtfully and read her name. He remembered the famous tycoon Jai Bonan, who was in charge of underground resource development in the lower city, and I think that was the name of his only daughter. He looked at the card again, making sure that the girl's name was indeed Jai Jixu. Lin Jai put his hand to his mouth and frowned. He looked at Jai Jixu, who was signing the card, with shining eyes. He thought that first of all he needed to earn money to renovate the store. The main character tried to calm down, because the best way to earn money is to receive money regularly. Lin Jai bowed and said that the book was taken for a month, and the maximum delay was a week. Jai Jixu sat opposite him. The main character took out a red umbrella and handed it to her, saying that it was still raining outside, so he would give her an umbrella along with the book, and asked her to return the umbrella along with the book. Jai Jixu took the umbrella and humbly thanked him for his help. She approached the exit, but turned to the main character and asked if she could get to know each other better. Lin Jai even thought that his words sounded like flirting. The guy's eyes widened and his pupils constricted. He believed that he had to answer with dignity. The main character smiled friendly, extended his hand to the girl and introduced himself, saying that he was an ordinary but sympathetic bookstore owner. Jai Jixu had a book under her arm and a cane in her left hand. She realized that Lin Jai had no plans to reveal his true identity. However, she believed that he should be on his side now. The girl opened the red umbrella and went outside, after which she wished the guy good night. Lin Jai smiled and waved to her, asking her to take care of herself and saying goodbye. He sat down at his desk, raised his hands and smiled, saying with satisfaction that another good deed had been done, and doing good deeds every day would make him feel good. The main character began to stretch and thought that this was what the creature that forced him to move into this world meant. He stood up from his chair and placed his hands on the table, saying that he needed to clean up and prepare for the next visitor. It was still raining outside, thunder roaring and lightning flashing. Lin Jai said that he is not sure if anyone else will come today. Jai Jixu walked along the wet paved road with an umbrella, leaning on a cane. She looked discouraged and slightly tense. She thought that Lin Jai was creepy, and that she needed to deal with the traitor as quickly as possible, and then go back and face him again. Suddenly something made her surprised and frightened. She frowned. Jai Jixu gripped her cane tighter, preparing for the impact. A mysterious, dark silhouette stood at a distance from her. The man held an umbrella in his right hand. He was dressed in a long cloak with fur on the collar and a cylindrical hat. In his other hand he held a book. His hand was bandaged. He had long claws. Continent Azir, Nazan. A huge blue moon hung over the city, covered by dark clouds. The rain continued to fall, and fog rose over the city. Lin Jai stood near the bookshelf and took a book from there. It was a book with a black cover about rituals and magic, and the author was Lin Jai himself. The main character opened his book and carefully held the pages with his gloved hand. He closed the book and looked at it with a smile. Reading this book, he felt nostalgic. After the transition, he settled in this city of Nazan, and he has been living here for 3 years. 2017, University Library. Lin Jai was then a doctor of folklore studies. He wore glasses and a blue shirt. The main character was reading another book. A young girl with red hair was putting the book back in place. She was wearing a dress and white gloves. She approached Lin Jai, calling him a teacher, and asked if he was leaving. He walked up to the bookshelf and waved to the girl, saying that he would read the book a little more. He said that she could go, and then he would close the door. The girl began to leave the library and said goodbye to the teacher. She went out into the corridor and met her friend, a girl in a purple dress. Her friend asked if teacher Lin Jai was still leaving. The girl apologized that she was late. She winked and pointed at the library and said that teacher Lin Jai loves books, and she heard that he collects books and spends his entire salary on it. Her friend was surprised and said that she was exaggerating. Lin Jai looked thoughtfully at the shelf and put a book there. He sighed tiredly with a slightly tense look. The huge moon was in the sky, in which there were no clouds. The university tower was decorated with red lighting. Lin Jai closed the door behind him. There was a buzz in the library and there was a large orange magic circle in the middle of the room. The main character stood in the middle of the room, and the same magic circle, but of a reduced size, appeared under his feet. Lin Jai said that the preparation of the ritual site has been completed. He knew that wishes don't come true by magic. He looked worried and tense and believed that as long as there was even a glimmer of hope, he was willing to pay any price. Lin Jai put his hand on the floor, where a bright glowing circle immediately appeared. Down on one knee, he was filled with hope. He asked to give him all the books in the world. Lin Jai continued to wait for a while without saying anything. He scratched his head as he squatted down and said that nothing worked. However, a small pillar of black liquid appeared behind him. This liquid turned into a huge red worm with a big mouth. Lin Jai stood up and lowered his head in irritation, saying that he knew that nothing would work out, and some magic circle would not fulfill his wish. Suddenly, behind his back, he felt the presence of a monster. He tensed as the monster approached him. The main character turned around in fear, a drop of sweat running down his cheek. The entire wall was covered with red tentacles, and a huge eye with spikes appeared in the middle. Two faces of Cthulhu could be seen near the floor. Lin Jai looked at what was happening in horror, but he realized that if he opened the door, his dream would come true, but he would never return to Earth. He was willing to pay this price. The corners of the guy's lips rose and he opened his mouth. With his left hand he touched the door, behind which there was a bright light. Now Lin Jai was sitting at his desk, holding his cup by the handle. Walking through that door, he found himself in Nazan. They didn't know it was so long ago. The main character was sitting on a chair and reading a newspaper, drinking tea. He believed that his current life was no different from his previous one, but he wondered whether he should pay for such a ritual. The thin pages of the yellowish newspaper rustled quietly. In this world there is no system that issues tasks, no weirdos come to him, so his days flow slowly. He thought it was great, and he could refresh his bookshelves every day, and he still had so many unread books. He looked happy, smiling. He closed his eyes and smiled softly. He just needs to communicate with visitors. The white cup was filled with warm black tea. Lin Jai believed that the happiness of life lies in such simple little things. He sat at his desk with his hand on his chin. He said he hasn't had any new visitors in a while and his communication skills don't seem to have deteriorated, which is great. He smiled slightly and exhaled in a relaxed manner. He thought that girl would also be happier today. Meanwhile, Jai Jixu looked straight ahead in horror, sweating profusely. Her yellow eyes reflected a mysterious silhouette. The man had gray hair and a beard. He was wearing a brown coat, and over it was a black robe with wool on the collar. He wore a hat from which hung a golden cross. The upper half of the face was hidden by a metal mask. In his left, bandaged hand he held a book. He walked towards Jai Jixu, trampling puddles. The girl's heels clicked loudly as he walked past her. Jai Jixu froze in place, her face conveying the horror she felt. The man's cloak fluttered through the air. The girl clenched her teeth and began to sweat from excitement. She thought about how she couldn't move. Her hand was frozen on the cane, and she could not move it. The unknown man turned around and looked at the book in Jai Jixu's hands and exclaimed. He looked at the girl with his green eyes and smiled, saying that she was lucky to receive this book. Jai Jixu felt as if a green snake was encircling her body and running its tongue across her cheek. She was trembling violently. Jai Jixu raised her head and looked at the stranger. After that, she turned her gaze to the book in the man's hands called Emptiness and Silence. Suddenly Jai Jixu was left alone on the street. There was silence, interrupted only by the sound of rain. The girl lost her balance and dropped her umbrella. She leaned against the wall and began to gradually slide down. She didn't know who it was, although she had some guesses. The man approached the doors of the bookstore. He began to slowly open the door. The bell above the door rang, signaling a new visitor. Lin Jai sat half sideways to the man. He greeted him. The man silently greeted him in response. Suddenly the main character's face changed. He smiled slightly and recognized his friend Frank Wilde in the man. He asked if he was going to return the book to him. Frank Wilde stood without a hat. He smiled widely, showing his teeth. They began to walk tensely towards each other. The man asked how he dared to pronounce his name. Lin Jai answered him in the affirmative. Frank Wilde asked if he had a new client and said that she took away a book he often reads. The main character replied that he decided that this book would be useful to her now. The man told him that he took this book last time. Lin Jai told him that it would be hard for an old man like him to read, but he didn't believe it. Frank Wilde told him that after reading the book, he realized that it was too difficult to understand, because there is a whole world there from birth to death, and based on his superficial knowledge, it is difficult to imagine how great the person was who managed to write such a wonderful book. The main character answered him that it was a dead giant. Jai Jixu stood in front of the bookstore as the rain continued to fall. The girl stood leaning against the wall and said that this person was Frank Wilde, nicknamed Black Faceless, a dark magician of the destructive level. According to the rules established by the Society of Truth in 1788, all supernatural beings are divided into 4 levels. The levels are also referred to as the classifications of abnormal, frightening, destructive, and indescribable. She imagined a sheet with this classification, which was torn at the bottom. The distinctive feature of Frank Wilde was the face mask. Jai Jixu imagined a gray mask lying on the floor near a pool of blood and a knife. Also, his feature was dark green snake eyes with a narrow pupil. A wanted poster for Frank Wilde was taped to the wall with a knife that read, "Location unknown, secret tower offering reward." One day Frank Wild got into a fight with one of the best fighters in the secret tower. As a result, an area of almost 10,000 kilometers was destroyed, and it reached a destructive level. Frank Wild and the second man had a battle in the city. There are only less than 10 destructive level supernatural creatures in Nazin, and there are less than 100 in all of Azir. Shu began to lose her balance again. She grabbed the wall, which immediately began to crack. The girl was breathing heavily. She smiled faintly and thought that it was nice to chat with such a powerful supernatural being. Jai Jixu bent down to pick up the umbrella from the road. She struggled to her feet and hobbled along the road, thinking that she had stumbled upon an unusual person. Lin Jai was looking through the books on the shelf and asked if Mr. Frank Wild was in a bad mood. He said that if he needed his help, he could ask for it. He stood with his back to the man, looking at the books. Frank Wild was one of the few old customers of his store. He comes here out of habit. Of course, a lonely old man just needs attention and company. As far as the main character knew, the man had 2 children, and he had bad relationships with both of them. His lovers leave him, and other magicians dislike him because of his appearance, so he is always lonely. Frank Wild was sitting at the table, holding a cup of hot tea in his hands. An ordinary lonely old man. The main character smiled, looking through the books, and remembered how they met him. It was 2 years ago. On the same rainy day, the door to Lin Jai's store opened. The golden bell hanging above the entrance rang loudly. The main character then wore glasses. He held a book in his hands and greeted the visitor. A man wearing a mask that completely hid his face entered the store. Lin Jai's instinct told him that this was an interesting visitor, and judging by his clothes, he was not short of money. The main character realized that he was deliberately hiding his face, and that he was a loner. At first glance, it seemed that he was a man of science and, apparently, a research scientist. This was Lin Jai's chance to chat with him. He grinned and carefully adjusted his black glasses. If he is careful, he can get a mature client. Frank Wild held out a book and asked if he could donate old books. He had several old books that must be collectible. The man put the book on the table. Lin Jai smiled and said that he could return the books. He put a cup of tea on the table and said that there was only black tea. He offered him tea to bond a little. Frank Wild turned away from him and thanked him, after which he said that his old face was quite scary. He did not want to cause unnecessary trouble. The main character looked at him from under his brows and extended his hand, answering that he was his client and he could not be afraid of him, and moreover, only stupid people look only at the appearance and do not try to look into the soul. Frank Wild silently looked at him with his snake eyes. He began to remove the cloth mask that covered the lower part of his face. He said the store owner is smart. Frank Wild took off his cloak and added that then he had better be polite and thank him for this tea. Lin Jai smiled slightly awkwardly and thought that the man's face was more strange than scary. He tried to hide his emotions and calm down. He realized that with the mask he was hiding old scars, but decided not to delve into the visitor's past. Frank Wild was sitting at the table and drinking tea. The main character looked at the books he brought. Judging by the books, the man studies many languages and is a highly qualified linguist. He decided to build on this topic. Frank Wild put the cup on the table and thanked him for the good tea. Lin Jai smiled as he twirled the book in his hands. He said that the books Frank Wild brought contained studies of very rare and even dead languages. He smiled even wider and said that between the words and lines there is magic and it's amazing. Frank Wild looked at him in surprise, shocked. He looked at the bookstore owner in shock and did not understand how he felt the magical power of these manuscripts. Before this, the man had erased all traces. Even a supernatural creature of a destructive level would not be able to sense anything. It was as if he saw the guy's sinister smile, thinking that he had been so calm all this time. Frank Wild could not understand what kind of person this was. He frowned and stared at him, thinking that he was very carefree. He guessed that he didn't sense an aura, but he was definitely not an ordinary person. Frank Wild, sitting at the table, said that he has been doing some language research. He asked if the main character had any research in this area, and if he didn't mind, if he could advise him on anything. Lin Jai smiled and picked up the book. He replied that he was not an expert in linguistics, but was engaged in research in related fields, and he had a couple of suitable books. He thought that professional scientists easily get used to physical loneliness, but even they cannot bear mental loneliness. It might be a good idea to point in a new direction. The main character put a book about the Wenju dialect on the table and said that he would like to recommend this book to him. This is one of the most complex dialects in existence, called the language of the devil, and unless Frank Wild is a linguist, he will never understand it. Lin Jai looked at the book with a blue cover and smiled ominously. Suddenly a cup of black tea cracked, spilling all the contents. Frank Wild bent over a book whose cover turned green and yellow spikes appeared on it. His lips twitched slightly and he opened his mouth slightly. After that, the corners of his mouth turned up and he said that this was the tongue of the devil. His hair hung down as he looked at the book with a smile. The main character was glad that everything was ready and he did it. He clenched his fist and smiled. Frank Wilde raised his hand and said that this was a very rare book, and he asked where he got it. This question made the guy confused. He looked puzzled. Lin Jai couldn't tell him the truth since they weren't in China. He could only tell him one thing. The main character put his hand on the table, leaning. He made a smart face and raised his hand up. He said that it was the language of one glorious and magnificent ancient civilization, and it was widely spoken there. He stopped smiling and put on a serious face and said that unfortunately he couldn't go back there anymore. Frank Wilde was surprised and confused by the words about an ancient civilization. He noticed the nostalgic tone with which the main character spoke. It seemed to him that this gentleman really was somehow connected with her. Frank Wilde put his hand on the table and began to think about how terrible this civilization was. He looked at Lin Jai and imagined a dark aura behind him. He wondered what kind of creepy creature he was. Lin Jai smiled friendly and extended his hand, asking his name. Frank Wilde introduced himself and said that his position was not worth mentioning. He bowed politely and politely asked the name of the shop owner. He introduced himself and asked not to be so polite. Frank Wilde turned to Lin Jai and pulled him away from his memories. The guy looked slightly confused. The man said that he had recently encountered some difficulties in his research. You could see old scars on his lips. He folded his hands in front of him, hiding half his face, and said that thanks to the devil's tongue, which he had lent him 2 years ago, he had found a new direction, and now he needed more literature about similar languages. He left his signature on the library card. The main character thought that Frank Wilde really calls the book the language of the devil, although this is just a funny nickname. The main character stood up and looked at him calmly, asking if he wanted to take a new book. 40 years ago, it was snowing in the mountains, completely covering the slopes and trees. The raven was sitting on a branch. Young Frank Wilde looked at the falling snow with an inspired face. In front of him, on a giant throne, sat a gray-bearded man with a crown on his head. He was a giant. The giant ordered him to die. His lips moved slowly, opening and closing. His hands were shackled to the throne. Frank Wilde turned around in fear, realizing that this was the magician's power. A black crow flew past. The large golden crown on her head sparkled. Mages manipulate language and the writing of power. Light magicians write spells, and dark magicians cast them. Frank Wilde stood on a snowy cliff. The giant began to slowly lean over him. He began to stare at him, his mouth parted. The giant's huge eye was right above Frank Wilde, who frowned and smiled. He said that after becoming a dark magician, while he tries to find the voice of his soul, creating his own language, he will find a path leading to the level of God. These memories stirred the elderly Frank Wilde. He looked dumbfounded. The main character smiled and pointed to a shelf of books, asking if he wanted to borrow a book of the same genre this time. Frank Wilde looked at him with a smart face and answered in the affirmative, saying that book is too complicated. Besides, it seems to be a dialect of another language that is deeply connected to cultural customs. He needs to better understand the hidden meaning. Lin Jai thought for a moment and put his fist to his chin, asking him to give him time to think. Frank Wilde sat on a chair and drank tea while the main character was looking for a suitable book. The man turned to him, rocking on his chair, and thought that Mr. Lin Jai was as selfless and generous as always. 2 years ago he had a battle with Abraham Joseph, which left him seriously injured. Frank Wilde's left arm was destroyed and erased, and he screamed in shock. When the man went astray, it was Lin Jai who guided him. The main character always greeted him with joy and open arms. He is able to pick up the rarest books and completely hide his aura from Frank Wilde, a magician of a destructive level. Lin Jai leafed through a book with a black cover with an interested face. Frank Wilde lowered his head while the main character sorted through the books on the shelf. The guy thought that this man was a hermit scientist, whose strength went far beyond the divine level. The main character was looking for a suitable option on the shelf, thinking that after 2 years he was finally able to begin researching forbidden spells based on the remaining knowledge from that book. All thanks to this well-read scientist. Frank Wilde looked at the young guy with hope and warmth. This time, the main character must express his gratitude well. What stood out on the shelf was a book with a red spine, authored by Lin Jai himself. He took the book under his arm and began to sit down on the chair, apologizing for the wait. He coughed awkwardly as he held out the book and said that he was a little presumptuous, but he suddenly thought that this book was quite suitable. Frank Wilde stretched out his hands to the book in surprise. Lin Jai coughed awkwardly again, turned away, and said that he was actually confident about this research. In the man's hands was a book with a large red eye surrounded by thorns. The sight of this book shocked Frank Wild. He grabbed the book in his hands and asked in surprise whether it was written by the main character. Lin Jai modestly straightened his tie and said that this was an insignificant job. He was ashamed. Frank Wild was taken aback. His hands were shaking. It was too unexpected for him. In his hands was a book called Rituals of the Corpse Eaters. He knew that there is a cult of truth of knowledge. These were people in light clothes with staffs in the form of crosses. The moon cult consisted of people in dark cloaks who worshiped the moon. There is also a cult of a high foggy wall. The shadow of a man with a scythe was visible on the wall. These are the three main beliefs known to Frank Wild. He stood in the middle of the room, his hands clenched into fists. Bloody rivers flowed down to black hands. The man had never heard of corpse eaters, and it seemed to him that the writer had an evil aura, and he thought that the main character was clearly not a kind person. Frank Wild decided that he was going to create faith. He picked up the book and asked if rituals were Lin Jai's area of research. The main character made a movement with his hand and replied that this was part of his research that changed his destiny. He cupped his palms and asked to forget about it, because it was a long time ago, and there is no point in remembering it. These words puzzled Frank Wild. He was embarrassed and looked at the guy in surprise. Lin Jai continued to sit with his hands folded. The man thought that a scientist who researches forbidden topics and has enormous power is doomed to be excluded from the main community, which is why Mr. Lin Jai is hiding from the world. Frank Wild took a closer look at the book and asked if the book was hand-bound. The main character lowered the corners of his lips and replied that due to some unfortunate circumstances, he did not have time to publish the book, so he only kept the version made by himself. He believed that if he had not been transported here, thanks to this book, he would have received the degree of assistant professor. He looked upset, imagining himself with black glasses and a mustache. Lin Jai put his fist on the table, which was shaking. Frank Wild looked at this confusedly. The guy smiled and extended his hand to the man, telling him that they had similar interests, so he would give him this book. But if he did not trust him, then he could recommend another book. The main character's words made Frank Wild even more confused. He thought that Lin Jai wanted to lend him this priceless original, although it was an experimental work and not yet published. The man looked at him gratefully and thanked him for his generosity, saying that he was honored to have the opportunity to read his works. However, Frank Wild still didn't know what he wanted to achieve from him. He twirled the book in his hands and said that such a precious book in a single copy was very painstaking work. The man lowered his head and, barely moving his lips, said that he was putting such an important thing in the hands of a nasty old man. He sat on a wooden chair, on the back of which hung his robe. The man said it really bothered him. In his mind, he wondered if Lin Jai wanted to experiment on him. The main character lowered his head, smiled and closed his eyes, sighing. He thought that Frank Wild was so kind, because at first he was interested, but when he learned that this book was the only one of its kind, on the contrary, he was embarrassed to borrow it. The guy decided to dispel his doubts. He patted his friend on the shoulder. Lin Jai stood next to him and began to calm him down, saying that he believed that he could add value to this book, and his research is only valuable if people notice it. The main character majestically raised his hand and said that the fact that this book is in a single copy does not bother him. He pointed to his impressive shelves of books and said that today he already has a whole collection. Lin Jai walked to the bookshelf and pointed to his head. He said that he could make a copy of the book at any time, because the knowledge in his head cannot be stolen. Only fame and fortune can be stolen. He turned his head and smiled confidently. He stated that fame and fortune are not important to him, after which he asked if Frank Wild understood him. The man was shocked and confused. He opened his mouth in surprise. Lin Jai looked at him slyly and mentally convinced him to take the book, thinking that this was his last chance to take this value. He is a lonely old man, and also a scientist. He needs fame and wealth to compensate for the emptiness in his soul. The main character looked confident in himself and his abilities. However, such thinking can turn into painful fanaticism, and this is harmful to health, so a man needs to be given the opportunity to be closer to the crowd and again feel the care of others. Lin Jai looked at Frank Wild, who had a stony face, with a smile. Suddenly, his face began to show insight, and Lin Jai mentally asked if he understood him. Frank Wild placed his bandaged left hand on the wooden table. He abruptly stood up from his chair and thanked the guy for his advice. Lin Jai looked calm. The man thought that with words about fame and wealth, the main character wanted to give him a warning so that he would not disclose anything to other people. Lin Jai closed his eyes and scratched his nose, saying that he wouldn't mind at all if he decided to recommend this book to someone else. Frank Wilde said he will do his best. As he speaks, the scars on his lips and cheeks become even more noticeable. He began to get ready, picking up his robe from the back of his chair. The man decided that this was the price that Mr. Lin Jai required him to pay. He hoped he could help spread his work. Frank Wilde put the book in his pocket, thinking that he not only had to not expose the identity of the owner of the book, but also not spread its contents. He believed that only he could study the book from the inside, and then convey the essence orally. The man placed his cylindrical hat on his head. He understood that he had to be careful. Frank Wilde stuck his hand into a black portal from which a green light emanated. He said thank you to the guy for his long-term guidance. The man extended his palm to the guy and said that he wanted to thank him and he hoped that this would not upset him. A stone figurine of a mythical gargoyle with large wings appeared in the room. The gargoyle sat on a stone pedestal. Lin Jai became a little embarrassed and tensed, beads of sweat running down his cheek. He asked if it was a gargoyle. Frank Wilde put his hand on his chest and bowed, saying that this was not a very valuable thing that would never repay his help, but he asked to accept a token of his gratitude. This gargoyle had been his work since his student days. His teacher appreciated it very highly. In those days, he stood on one knee behind a statue of a gargoyle, illuminated by green fire, with a huge finger pointed at him. The gargoyle has sufficient magical resistance and durable skin, extremely sharp claws and fangs, automatically recognizes the intent to kill, and in terms of combat power is not a bit inferior to elite warriors. The gargoyle had an open jaw and a white mask with red and yellow horns on its face. Frank Wilde looked confident, with a strand of gray hair falling across his face. Lin Jai took the figurine in his hands and looked at it admiringly. He thought that Frank Wilde was very shy, since he said that it was not that valuable, but the work was so elegant, almost realistic. Even despite the cost, it was a very valuable sign of gratitude. He took the gargoyle by the wing with his left hand, and placed his right hand under the pedestal. He knew that the statue could be used to drive out evil spirits, since the role of the gargoyle is close to that of the stone that wards off evil. Since this is a sign of Frank Wilde's gratitude, the protagonist will accept this mundane reward. He placed the gift on the table, stroked the statue's wing, and said that it was an extremely exquisite work of art, suiting his elegant taste. He couldn't wait to see how he would bring the gift next time. Frank Wilde put his right hand on his chest and said that he was very glad that he liked it. He lightly squeezed the edge of his robe, thinking that this was just one gargoyle of a frightening level, and the value of a book by such a high-ranking person as Mr. Lin Jai was enough to create tens of millions of gargoyles. The figurine was placed on the table. Lin Jai closed his eyes and smiled with satisfaction. Frank Wilde looked at him, thinking that Mr. Lin Jai was still so merciful, deliberately expressed praise so as not to offend him. The man stood under the lamp, straightened his hat and said goodbye, saying that next time he would definitely prepare a gift that the main character would be pleased with. Frank Wilde looked at the guy from under his brows and thought that the gift should be valuable enough to reach the divine level. Lin Jai smiled and waved to him. He said that he would look forward to it and would be glad to meet again. The man waved back and headed towards the exit. The main character turned over the sign on the door, indicating that the store was closed. His brown eyes looked attentive and interested. He looked at the gargoyle enthusiastically, putting his hand to his chin. Lin Jai thought if it was possible that Frank Wilde would give him a gargoyle again, so that he could have both a male and a female, that would be really elegant. Then he wondered if gargoyles even had males and females. He looked at the carved details on the figurine. The main character smiled and looked at the majestic wings of the gargoyle, thinking that the energy was rushing, and the containment of power was simply wonderful. The guy stretched a little tiredly, saying that he was almost done for today, and maintaining a clear mind is really easier to attract good luck. Suddenly a black liquid appeared on the guy's table. He turned around questioningly, looking at the droplets rising into the air. The next moment, his face became agitated and tense. The main character frowned and his face began to sweat. The black liquid began to take the form of a phrase, which meant that they had not seen each other for a long time. Lin Jai looked at it in shock, recognizing something familiar in the liquid. The main character was taken aback, looking at the shapeless slurry. The guy frowned and opened his mouth slightly, realizing that this was what was behind his transfer to another world. And 3 years later he appeared again. Lin Jai sighed tensely, trying to calm down. He sat down on a chair and raised his hand. The guy said that since he appeared so suddenly, then it was his time to pay the price. He asked me to tell him everything straight. He will do everything. The main character frowned and thought that after all this unknown creature had helped him achieve what he wanted, he was still friendly. He must belong to the class of good gods. He imagined in his head how he was smiling at a black, shapeless creature with red eyes. Lin Jai believed that the fee could be exorbitant. Suddenly his eyebrows rose in surprise when he saw something. The liquid began to gradually form a phrase that DZY had awakened and had already begun his search. Suddenly, Lin Jai realized that it was because he allowed Frank Wilde to recommend the book. It was as if he had been struck by thunder. The liquid formed into a hieroglyph indicating an affirmative answer. Lin Jai put his fist on his knee and asked if he was required to force other people to recommend and distribute his book. He smiled friendly and put on a confident face, asking if this was beneficial for him. The unknown creature answered in the affirmative again, a drop of liquid shaking in the air. The main character stood up from the table and enthusiastically said that he had no more questions and would do everything he could. The mysterious creature disappeared in an instant, leaving Lin Jai alone. The guy looked thoughtful. He put his fist to his chin. It was still raining outside. There was a guy in a dark robe standing on the balcony. He said that it was drizzling. He was wearing a black mask over his face and his hands were in gloves. He held the phone in his hands and reported that Frank Wilde, nicknamed the Black Faceless, suspected of participation in the feud of hunters, was found on 23rd Street in Nazen. The guy was concentrated. His gaze was clear. He said that Frank Wilde had been in the bookstore for about an hour, which was extremely suspicious. He thought that this bookstore could be a secret base for dark magicians. At this time, his interlocutor, a guy with glasses, was writing something with a pen. He said that his intelligence was very important. He would inform the teacher Abraham Joseph, and as soon as he figured it out, he should come back and tell in detail what he saw. The guy in the black mask replied that he understood everything. Suddenly Frank Wilde appeared behind him, calling him a rat and quite brave. The guy looked shocked. He turned around in fear, holding a dagger in his hand. But the man grabbed him by the face, forcing him to stop. Frank Wilde looked at him coldly. He looked threatening. He ordered the guy to die. A black silhouette of a guy appeared in the sky, attacked by a snake with blue eyes. An unknown guy was killed. His phone fell to the floor, and the interlocutor asked what happened. Frank Wilde stepped on the phone, breaking it into small pieces. He adjusted his hat, casting a brief glance down at the dead guy. He said that by daring to look into this man's house, let him not even think of regretting death. Frank Wilde narrowed his eyes a little, finally examining this place. The sky was overcast with dark clouds and the rain was not even going to stop. A guy with blonde hair named Claude approached the office of the intelligence department of the secret Basha to the head of the department. He looked worried, but knocked on the door anyway. Still in the corridor, he told the Lord Knight that he had a report of an anomalous case. The boss with the silver hand was sitting at the table. A white-haired man with a beard and a large scar on his nose took off his glasses and sighed. He leaned back in his beige chair and rubbed the bridge of his nose, allowing Claude to enter the office. He was wearing a black shirt and green pants. Claude smiled awkwardly, closing his eyes, and entered the office. He began to approach the boss's desk. The white-haired man asked if something had happened to the magic mirror egg again. He abruptly stood up from his chair and slammed his prosthetic on the table, shouting that these hunters really were a bunch of stupid people. Claude was scared by the unexpected reaction. The boss got angry and slammed his fist on the table, shouting that if it weren't for them, he would now be quietly enjoying his retirement. He threatened to train boxing on their mother's gravestones. The impact left a small hole on the table. Claude was shaking with tension. He adjusted his glasses and said that the teacher should pay attention to the image. The boss adjusted his mechanical arm and sighed, asking the guy what he was afraid of. He exhaled through his nose and asked if he had closed the door. Claude still looked scared. The guy clutched a tablet with papers to his chest and asked for forgiveness, saying that this time the situation was different. The boss sat down in his chair and closed his eyes. He said that this was something new, and then asked what incident could be more important than the mess caused by these mad dogs. Claude began flipping through the report and reported that the spy tracking the hunter's movements was killed on 23rd Street, and according to his report, before his death, he found out the location of Frank Wilde. This shocked the boss. His eyes widened and his mouth dropped open. He clenched his teeth and asked again whose location had been discovered. Claude lowered his head and adjusted his glasses, presenting the Frank Wilde mask. He said that they had found out the location of the Black Faceless, a magician of a destructive level. 2 years ago he disappeared after the Battle of the White Hills. At the moment they had put up a reward for him. The guy frowned and began to sweat. He said that he didn't even think that Frank Wilde managed to survive. These 2 years only the boss was sure that he was still alive. The man smiled madly, stood up from his chair and put his hands on the table. He said that no one understands the habits of this bug better than him, and finally he crawled out of the sewer. The boss looked at his metal arm and said that he never thought he would end up in Nazen, right under his nose, adding insult to injury. He frowned and looked at Claude, asking what Frank Wilde was doing on 23rd Street. The guy looked seriously at the boss and flipped through the report. He said that the information received is limited because they suspect that the spy was killed by Frank Wilde. All that is currently being investigated is that he entered a very ordinary bookstore, and he was there for over an hour, apparently buying or taking books. The boss hit the table with his prosthetic and shouted that it was impossible, that a dark magician who gains power by relying on his tongue was buying books. He looked furious and angry. The man asked if they checked the information about the bookstore, because there was definitely something wrong there. Claude glanced at the report and replied that they had checked, and the bookstore was listed as a member of the Ash Chamber of Commerce. The store had been open for 3 years, had a good reputation and a small number of visitors. He imagined an image of Lin Jai surrounded by books in his head and said that the shop owner is a foreigner, and initially there were suspicions that this might be a secret base of dark magicians, but now they are not very sure about it. The formidable boss calmed down a little and asked what exactly they were not sure about. Claude replied that they were not sure about the Ash Chamber of Commerce. He imagined a man with a staff and a little girl in front of an unknown man with deer antlers. Claude said that the Ash Chamber of Commerce is the property of druid priests. They are light magicians who believe in nature and are unlikely to be at one with a dark magician. The chief's fist clenched and began to shake. Claude trembled and replied that if they rushed, they might damage the reputation of the Ash Chamber of Commerce, and the druids might start protesting against the secret tower. The boss hit the wooden wall and called them a bunch of problem vegetarians. He looked angry and annoyed. Claude was confused and thought that druids were not vegetarians. The boss, still keeping his hand on the wall, turned to him and asked if he was thinking about something indecent. Claude began to deny. The man took several heavy and noisy steps. He stood opposite Claude and put his hand on his shoulder, scaring the guy. The chief made an angry face and asked what the knight's task was. Claude sweated heavily and answered in a trembling voice that they needed to eliminate the darkness and maintain peace. Expensive chandeliers hung on the ceiling. The boss said that in this case they could not become like the darkness and compromise with their accomplices. He said Frank Wilde had been in the store. He imagined their enemy chatting amiably with the store owner. Then he reads the book carefully. After that, an image of Frank Wilde, who was drinking tea cutely, popped into his head. The boss asked if he could do all these things. A vein bulged on his forehead from anger. He asked his dear follower Claude if an evil dark magician could read a book in a completely ordinary bookstore. He started screaming so loudly that the hair on Claude's head flew through the air. The man said that if he really thought so, then he would put on the mithril-pointed shoes and beat him. The young guy's lower body began to tremble. He tried to argue with his boss that the Ash Chamber of Commerce was still funding 40% of their scouting unit. These words made the boss become silent and embarrassed. They stood for a while in awkward silence, no one in a hurry to start a conversation. The boss turned away and sighed wearily. He grabbed his outerwear from the golden hook on the wall. The man began to put on a black coat and announced that he would personally go to 23rd Street. He needs to see what's going on with this bookstore. Claude bowed humbly and agreed with his teacher. He went out into the dark corridor. There was a sign on the wall with the location of the intelligence, cultivation, combat, and logistics departments. He walked down the pillared hall, where he greeted the knights. The coat on his shoulders fluttered majestically through the air. His subordinates greeted him and asked how he was doing. They said the Lord Knight was working hard. The tower itself looked gloomy, surrounded by dark pipes and long passages. The man pressed the button in the elevator with his metal prosthesis. He began to ride down in the elevator with panoramic windows. In his hands was a file on Lin Jai with his photograph. The man smiled evilly, showing his teeth, and said that he would find out how clean he was. This man was Abraham Joseph, one of the 10 great knights of the secret tower. Suddenly his look became frightened, and Abraham Joseph himself began to sweat. He grabbed his head and began to lose his balance, experiencing hallucinations. The man put his hand on his face and a red light appeared in front of him. A sword appeared in front of Abraham Joseph, which just emitted a red light. He thought that over and over again he was overtaken by the curse of the magic sword of light. The man put his hand in front of him, and the environment began to change. Suddenly he found himself underwater, being dragged down by tentacles. The tentacles had eyes and teeth. Abraham Joseph opened his mouth in a silent scream. A guy with long hair in knight's armor appeared out of nowhere. He closed Abraham Joseph's mouth and began to push him down. The man began to fall down into the water funnel, trying to grab onto something. Suddenly his eyes opened and his face was covered in sweat. He stood on the street, clutching the wall, trying to catch his breath. He looked at his right hand, which held the wet file. The rain continued to fall. Abraham Joseph tutted and said that today he might not go to that bookstore. He exposed his metal hand to the rain, and a small puddle immediately appeared in his palm. He thought that the madness of the first owner of the Sword of Light and his imminent death contained a curse in the sword that drove him mad. Only a strong-willed knight with an unshakable will can subdue the Sword of Light and curb its curse. Abraham Joseph did not expect that the opposite effect would occur so quickly, and that he would not have time to find a receiver. He clenched his metal hand, splashing the water. The man looked at his fist, water running all over his face. He said sadly that the great and invincible knight of the sacred flame is now nothing more than an elderly cripple. Abraham Joseph stood in the middle of the street while it was raining. A withered corpse with its arms torn off lay on the ground. A silhouette of a man can be seen on the balcony of a Gothic building. The dark-robed man put his hands on the partition and said that the sudden activity was really surprising. He was the first leader of the White Wolf organization named Helix. Under the hood, blonde hair down to his neck was visible, and there were 2 scars on his lips. He thought that he had underestimated that lady. She was not as useless as she might have seemed. She could even take the role of second leader. He decided to see what his subordinates could do when faced with this. In the next room, another man stood in the dark. He was silent. The foot in the high-heeled boots took a step forward. Jai-Jitsu stood in front of a burning building, and even the rain could not put out the fire. The girl looked at this with an emotionless face. She was once the second leader of the White Wolf organization. One of the bandits ran forward. He attacked the girl with a knife in his hand. Another pumped-up man with gray hair stood behind her. They wished the girl death. Someone launched a kunai on a chain. Within a minute, her enemies were killed. She lowered her head and stood silently. The girl turned around and asked how Max, who was sitting on the roof of a nearby building, was doing. Max was wearing a black sleeveless shirt and green pants. He had futuristic glasses on his eyes. The guy said that it was confirmed that Helix had the egg. He was completely crazy for carrying out a massacre within the Hunter organization immediately after taking possession of the egg. Jai-Jitsu's hand began to tremble as she held the cane. Max went down and opined that while their people were not strong enough, Helix had already teamed up with the third leader, Kaji. He was afraid that this attack could end in death. The girl began to approach them, her heels clicking on the wet road. It was a girl named Kate. She was wearing a revealing dress and stockings. She had pink hair and a golden wing on her left eye. On her back was a double-edged sword shaped like a chainsaw blade. With her left hand she was dragging the unconscious man. Kate said that Helix has powerful strength. Among the White Wolves he is the closest to the frightening level, and Kaji has trained many hunters in the organization. She was afraid that the two had deliberately teamed up against Miss Jai-Jitsu. Kate frowned and bared her teeth, saying that she, my lady, faced betrayal because of the fool who was looking for the person behind her. Jai-Jitsu smiled and winked at her, thanking the girl. She said that if she had not then exchanged clothes with her and helped her hold off her pursuers, she would never have gotten out of the siege. She imagined Kate in her clothes with a cloak covering her face. Behind them stood various monsters. Jai-Jitsu looked very grateful. She even blushed a little and extended her hand to Kate. She said that now she is again standing in front of her, struggling with the obstacles of fate, all thanks to her. Kate smiled sweetly, putting her fist to her chest. She thought she was amazing. She could see her reflection in Jai-Jitsu's eyes. Kate didn't know what had happened to her, but when she returned, she was suddenly able to suppress the effects of the tainted blood and maintain her sanity without turning into a beast. The girl introduced Jai-Jitsu, who opened her mouth, and underneath her was a wolf with sharp fangs. Kate believed that this was literally beyond the hunter's understanding. She imagined a wolf tearing a man apart with its jaws against the backdrop of the full moon. She thought about that spotless white figure, traveling through time and space, tracking and killing enemies, just like a god. Instead, a man with a black mustache and sideburns completed the thought. He said that Helix is strong, and the fact that he is just close to the intimidating level makes the boss truly intimidating. Jai-Jitsu and Kate looked at him in surprise, turning their heads. This man's name was Ryan, nicknamed Mouse. He is an intelligence officer for the White Wolf organization. Ryan was wearing a brown coat and had a black hat on his head. He rubbed his hands together and said that once the beast transformed, Helix and Kaji would become easy targets. Kate and Max were arguing about something. The girl looked irritated. Jai-Jitsu tiredly lowered her head and frowned. She thought that allies should always have such a person. Ryan had a tattoo on his neck in the shape of a square with spikes on the sides. He had a rune of loyalty imprinted on his soul. At least Jai-Jitsu could trust him. Her large yellow eyes opened wide and her pupils constricted. The girl believed that Kate and Max would be able to resist the power of destruction of the magic mirror egg thanks to the rune of a light magician under the auspices of the family. They also had tattoos on their bodies, like Ryan. The guy and the girl were arguing about something. Kate looked unhappy. Jaijixu threw her head back and said that she has tainted blood flowing in her. Hunting the ferocious dream beast has already become conscious. Max stood half sideways and looked to the right. Kate smiled sweetly and looked calm. Ryan's eyebrows were slightly arched and he had a small smirk on his face. Jaijixu took out her whip and belligerently shouted to the hunters that there was no turning back. Her team was ready. Max was holding a kunai, and Kate asked Milady to be careful. Ryan smiled silently, looking at everyone from under his brows. Jaijixu stood at the head of their small detachment and ordered them to start entering, because this was a decisive battle. They approached the entrance to the church, and a carved wooden door appeared in front of them. The door was hit with force, causing it to begin to crack. The door was torn to pieces, and the squad entered the church. The floor was tiled and there were benches on the sides. At the end of the room stood Kaji, the third eye of the White Wolf organization. His chest was pierced by the hilt of a scythe, and he was dressed in church attire. Jaijixu and Kate pointed their weapons at him, the latter asking if Kaji was alone and where Helix was. Black blood was coming from Kaji's mouth. He smiled and chuckled. Jaijixu ran up to him and reached out with her hand. She said that something was wrong. She placed her right hand on Kaji's shoulder. Suddenly his hair began to fly. Kaji leaned back, his eyes seeming to bulge out of their sockets, and his mouth stretched into a crazy smile. There was blood coming from his mouth and eyes. Jaijixu turned to her allies and ordered them to give her an injection. Max picked up the red syringe, following the order, and Kate covered her mouth with her hands in horror. With one movement of his hand, Max threw the syringe to Jaijixu. She successfully caught it and injected Kaji. His eyes continued to bleed, and sharp fangs began to appear in his mouth. Fur began to appear on his face, and Kaji himself grinned. Jaijixu grabbed him by the collar and ordered him to answer where Helix was and whether he left after taking the magic mirror egg. All of Kaji's teeth turned into sharp fangs. His ears became pointed, and part of his face was covered with dark fur. He said with a croak that he would come. A second later, his body was hit right through by the thorns. Drops of his blood fell on Jaijixu's face and clothes. Out of anger, she hit the wall, breaking it. Max approached her from behind and offered to go to Highwood and ask him, because he, as a magician, obliged to his family. He certainly would not refuse help. Jaijixu replied that it was not worth it, and ordered Kate and Max to continue searching. They looked at her a little scared and confused, but Kate obeyed her. Jaijixu said that Ryan would go with her. Looking surprised and slightly confused, the man asked where they would go. The girl raised her head up, looking up. She stood firmly on her feet, leaning on her cane, and answered that they would go to 23rd Street. Lin Jai was sitting at his desk and drinking tea at this time. The hot drink in the cup was releasing steam. The main character drank tea and read a book, thinking that this was another idle day. 3 days have passed since Frank Wilde and Jaijixu visited him, but no one has visited him. He raised the cup to his mouth and took a sip of the drink. Even though he barely has enough to eat now, he still owes a lot to that little black girl. She had short purple hair and was wearing a red dress. Lin Jai owed her gratitude for the funding of his bookstore, the official business license, and the temporary residence permit that she had given him. At their meeting, he gave her a book about nonviolent communication. He hoped that this book he recommended to her could help her, because school violence was just terrible. Lin Jai closed his eyes tiredly, holding a cup in his hands. He frowned and lowered his gaze, thinking that there would be no visitors again in this weather. He had to think about how he could recommend the book he wrote, because accidents like Miss Jaijixu's were quite rare. Suddenly his gaze rose and became surprised. He greeted the visitor. It turned out to be Jaijixu herself. She closed the door behind her with a click. She wore a white dress with black and blue details. The girl straightened her hair and smiled shyly, blushing. She apologized for the trouble. Lin Jai looked at her in surprise, not knowing what to say. A second later, he came to his senses and greeted Jaijixu, smiling and waving at her. He was thinking about what he had just said about regular customers, and she came. Is his book business finally taking off? He believed that this life could bring him good luck and prosperity. For this it was worth investing heavily in his studies. The main character stood up from his chair and said that he didn't expect to meet again in just 3 days. Customers weren't returning to his meager bookstore after such a short time. She was the first. Jaijixu's cheeks turned red. She gritted her teeth and opened her mouth slightly. She felt that Mr. Lin Jai was very disappointed with her, because obviously, Having received such good instructions, she should have solved everything instantly, but halfway through she came to the bookstore for help. Jixu looked stiff and embarrassed as she put her fist to her chest. She even thought that she was the most useless of his visitors. She slowly opened her eyes, her cheeks still red. Suddenly, she noticed something new on Lin Jai's desk. She looked at the detailed gargoyle figurine, realizing that it was used by magicians, and even without an aura it was very intimidating. She opened her mouth in confusion, still looking awkward. She believed that Lin Jai discovered the gargoyle while hiding like an ordinary person. She looked at the smiling protagonist and the statuette. She wondered if this would calm her down. She thought that even if she was weak, like a child, would he still be tolerant and approving of her as always? Jixu decided that these questions were too arrogant. She looked down guiltily and asked for forgiveness for upsetting her. Ryan then entered the store and asked the girl if they had come to the place where she was going to take him. He held her cloak in his hands. The man took a step forward and began to look around the room, not understanding whether it was a bookstore. Suddenly his gaze became surprised and confused when he saw an ordinary person. Jixu stood near Lin Jai's desk. The main character asked who came to them. She pointed her finger at Ryan and said that this is her subordinate. His loyalty is absolute and Lin Jai need not worry. The guy sighed, pouring tea into a cup. He thought that she was a poor thing and a child who was surrounded by scoundrels. He also wondered what she meant by absolute fidelity. Suddenly he realized something, causing his face to change. He looked at the girl who sat down at the table and continued pouring tea. He realized that if she had already taken revenge on that fool, as he advised, then she would not be so insecure now. Besides, she just said she upset him. Lin Jai handed her a cup of tea and asked if she had failed. Jixu put her hands on the table in front of her and decided that Mr. Lin Jai already knew everything. She awkwardly lowered her head and answered the main character's question in the affirmative. She said that the traitor escaped and they still don't know where. The girl said that she had already sent someone to search, but there were still no leads. Her fight with him lasted 2 days, and I had made so much progress thanks to Lin Jai's leadership that he was almost steadily retreating. Jixu began to shake and said that yesterday, after 5 hours of fierce battle, despite great expenses, she was able to destroy his headquarters, but by that time she realized that he already knew that her opponent was not him, so that, abandoning his ally, he fled. Now it seems that she underestimated the enemy, and the fact that everything was going smoothly was an unusual warning. Lin Jai looked at her slightly worried. Jixu lowered her head in frustration, hiding her gaze, and apologized for getting carried away quickly. The main character smiled good-naturedly and poured himself some tea. He said she doesn't have to apologize and it's not her fault. The guy took a sip of hot black aromatic tea. He smiled awkwardly and closed his eyes, not understanding what happened. He didn't understand how this lady turned the relationship into a war. Jixu looked at him a little angrily, as if asking him what was wrong. Lin Jai remembered that everyone says that love is like a battlefield. Only in this case, love is the battlefield. He imagined in his head the relationship between romantic relationships, war, and money. The main character folded his hands in front of him and assumed that the girl was used to using some business terms, so her descriptions became strange. He decided that this would be easier to explain. Lin Jai thought that she meant that she had been communicating with the fool for 3 days, but in the end, Jixu realized that this cunning guy had already found a good way to escape. The main character decided that he had prepared in advance by leaving his friend as bait and disappearing with Miss Jixu's stolen money. In his head, he imagined their relationship like frames on film. He continued pouring tea from the white teapot. Lin Jai sat down on a chair, put one leg on the other, and said that he already understood everything. Jixu smiled and asked hopefully what he thought about it. Ryan was shaking a little behind him. He looked nervous and tense, with a bead of sweat running down his forehead. The man's eyes were wide open and his pupils constricted. He didn't understand what was happening. Some time ago he was standing outside. It was still raining outside. Ryan was talking to someone on the phone. The interlocutor asked if he said that the black faceless Frank Wilde is now in Nazen. He wanted to ask how he found out this top secret information, but the man interrupted him with his question. He asked if he doubted the reliability of his information. The interlocutor said that, as expected from Mr. Ryan, he easily did what they could not. He felt nervous and his blood ran cold. The man smiled, leaning against the wall, and told him not to flatter him, and also that he was going to lie low with someone for a while, and if he needed information, he should contact his informant at the Truth Society. The interlocutor thanked him and was about to tell him his next goal, but Ryan, who smiled slyly, had already said that this was a baby with milk not yet dry on her lips, and ordered to use the mark as insurance, but he did not know whether it would be easy to find it. He said that the power she wields is quite interesting. He was discovered by Kate, who appeared nearby and said that she had found where he was hiding. The girl arrogantly pointed her finger at him and said that the miss was looking for him and he could prepare to leave. She reminded him that he was now my lady's servant, and not a wild mouse running around on the floor, and advised him to learn manners. Ryan feigned guilt and adjusted his hat and apologized for keeping Miss waiting. He said that he would come right away. He headed straight down the street. There was a brown mouse sitting behind some wooden boxes. Ryan thought that this was an opportunity to freely control the ability of transformation, and if they managed to get hold of this dangerous information, they would be able to destroy all hunter organizations. Having received it, even a sewer mouse can become the king of beasts. He walked with a sly grin on his face, thinking that there was no need to disappoint. At the moment, he stood with a frightened face while he sweated. He looked at Jai Jixu in surprise, not understanding why Milady was so respectful towards an ordinary person, as if she had encountered the strongest divine level. The girl begged Lin Jai to help her. The main character pointed to the side and said that she didn't need to worry, because everything was simpler than she thought. He said that now her enemy is not he, but something else. This was her fear, and she just had to wait. Good news would definitely come. Ryan imagined an ancient Chinese scientist in glasses in his head. After that, the image of an incompetent fighter who created a false school of martial arts popped into his head, and at the end he remembered a politician in a suit. The man realized that Lin Jai was using boasting, empty words and double entendres, which were tricks used by scammers. When Ryan realized this, a look of horror appeared on his face. He believed that Lin Jai was a liar. Suddenly, the main character smiled awkwardly, apologized and asked him to wait. He put his cup of tea on the table and said that he needed to sort something out just for 5 minutes. Lin Jai was embarrassed because he thought there would be no guests, so he drank too much tea. The main character stood up from his chair under the uncomprehending glances of Ryan and Jai Jixu. The man excitedly turned to the girl, asking what she was doing. She turned to him and pointed an angry finger at him, asking what was wrong with his tone. She replied that she took him with her because the information he had might be useful, not because she trusted him or valued him. Jai Jixu asked if he knew that he should be polite. Ryan frowned and tensed, looking at the girl. He got defensive and said the store owner was a total liar. He stated that although he does not know manners, he is sure that Lin Jai is a fraudster, because there is no one who knows this better than him. According to him, although the main character is an excellent liar, he can find at least 3 people who do it at the same level as him. He tried to convince the girl that he didn't want to see Jai Jixu being deceived again. The girl put a blade to his throat and ordered him to shut up. She held her weapon in her hands and said aggressively that she shouldn't have brought him here. If he wasn't still useful, she would have cut him down with her sword right now. Ryan winked his eye and smiled, trying to calm down. He thought that the girl was easy to manipulate. You just need to divert her attention from him with the help of blind faith and Zai. He told her that he was faithful to her and she would definitely find out soon. An arrow coated in green poison emerged from the man's sleeve. He said he would prove it to her after he came down. Suddenly, a large shadow fell on them. The gargoyle seemed to come to life and increase in size. The statue stuck out its long tongue. Ryan seemed petrified and could not move. The gargoyle's stone hand suddenly grabbed the man. Jai Jixu looked shocked and confused, not knowing what was happening. The gargoyle carried the man straight towards its giant mouth. He looked in fear as he approached the monster's sharp fangs. The silhouette of the statue looked frightening, because it was several times larger than Jai Jixu. The girl seemed frozen. She could not move and looked at the statue in fear. The gargoyle's huge tongue stuck out, the tip of which dripped blood onto the floor. Suddenly, the statue began to shrink in size and became normal again. Lin Jai began to walk down the stairs and apologized for the wait. He looked down at the frightened girl and asked where her subordinate was. Jai Jixu didn't dare to tell the truth. She turned around and showed her sweaty face, replying that he had an urgent matter. Drops of rain fell on the roofs of buildings, and lightning flashed in the sky. While Lin Jai was going downstairs, Ju was sitting on a chair and thinking that the gargoyle had grabbed Ryan and she needed to warn the store owner about this. She looked at the statue in fear and said that at that moment neither Ryan nor she had time to react, and if the gargoyle had attacked her, she would have died immediately. The girl looked at the deadly statue that had killed her ally a few moments ago. Jai Jixu's face was reflected in the gargoyle's red eyes. The girl hugged herself and began to tremble in horror. She thought that this was exactly what meeting death felt like. Her blood ran cold. It scared her too much. Lin Jai slowly walked down the stairs while the girl was afraid that he immediately noticed Ryan's disrespect and doubts, but did not dare to attack himself. Instead, he easily found an excuse to go upstairs, allowed the gargoyle to kill this ignorant and fearless man. She remembered Ryan falling straight into the monster's throat. Jai Jitsu believed that this technique was so graceful and tough, and even this contemptuous attitude towards life corresponded to the character of a dark magician. She didn't know what to do, and she shouldn't have taken that vile rat with her. Jai Jitsu covered her frightened face with her hand in horror. After all, she not only asked for help, but also upset Mr. Lin Jai. She was afraid that the main character would think that she ordered it. The guy walked up to the entire table and asked the frightened girl what happened. There was a slight smile on his face that was supposed to be endearing. He said that she didn't have to worry, she could relax here. His expression began to look creepy to Jai Jitsu. Lin Jai extended his hand and said that there was no need to be so afraid, because he would not eat it. These words frightened the girl even more. She screamed and tears appeared in her eyes. Her eyes began to go blank and she put her palms on her face and asked for forgiveness. She started waving her arms from side to side, crying. Jai Jitsu apologized for her rude servant and said that she should not have brought him here. Lin Jai smiled incomprehensibly and raised one eyebrow. He wondered why she was even more nervous when he was just joking. The main character made an emotionless face and looked behind the frightened girl, thinking that she really believed and thought that he could eat a person. He sat down at his chair, wearily clutching his head. He wondered if a harmless and kind person like him could do such cruel things. He believed that this girl really seemed not from this world. It seemed to him that she believed everything that people said. And now it was not surprising to him that she was so cruelly deceived by this idiot, meaning Ryan. A slight smile appeared on Lin Jai's face. He realized that nothing would work out this way. He decided to take the opportunity to chat with Jai Jitsu. She gained confidence last time, so she came for help. This time he just needs to control everything and then everything will work out for the client. Jai Jitsu seemed to see an eerie shadow behind the friendly guy. Lin Jai looked into her eyes and apologized for the bad joke. He said that if she had any ideas, she could just say so. He would try to help. The girl sighed with relief. She was glad that Mr. Lin Jai forgave her mistake, and now she will be more careful. She apologized for the trouble and asked to recommend a suitable book to her because her will was too weak. He put his hand on the table and asked to give him time to think. The main character looked slightly puzzled, but still began to sort through the books. Lin Jai thought that he had only been gone for 5 minutes, but this girl looked like she had gone through some kind of shock. He thought that the reason was that her subordinate suddenly had an urgent matter. He decided to talk about this subordinate while simultaneously taking out a book. While he was reaching for the right book, he said that subordinate did not have entirely the right views. Jai Jitsu was a little scared by his words. Lin Jai turned to her with a serious face and advised her to talk less about absolute fidelity. The girl suddenly jumped up from the table and asked how this was possible. She abruptly interrupted her speech, her gaze becoming unfocused. She realized that Mr. Lin Jai would not say this without a reason, which meant that there might be something wrong with the loyalty rune. The white magician, with the help of runes, placed the mark of fidelity, and only one person knows how to remove it. A strange image appeared in her head. A huge hand with a gold bracelet hung over a man in a black robe, next to whom Ryan stood. The rune on his soul was placed by Highwood, a clan mage supported by Jai Jitsu's father. If the Ryan rune no longer works, this means that Highwood most likely transferred it to another person without asking. Jai Jitsu became very upset. She lowered her shoulders and head, saying that she did not know what to believe. Lin Jai decided to give her advice. He said in a calm voice that she could only rely on herself and trust only herself. The main character was holding a book in his hands. He approached the girl and said that someone else's soul is darkness, and no means will help to completely open the human heart to her. Therefore, when a person is as invulnerable as steel, no one can defeat him. He handed Jai Jitsu a book. On the spine it was written, how the steel was tempered. The girl looked in surprise at the proposed book, repeating its title. Lin Jai closed his eyes and smiled peacefully, asking him to read this masterpiece carefully. No matter what she learns, it will help. The book had an interesting blue cover with gray patterns. Lin Jai believed that you need to strike while the iron is hot. He decided to cheer up Miss using a famous phrase from the book. Jai Jitsu held a book in both hands, pressing it to her chest. Lin Jai put his hand on her shoulder and said that the most valuable thing for a person is life, because he only has one. The main character smiled and continued to quote lines from the book. In the book it was written that a person's voice should be like this, looking back at the past. Do not regret the absurd, vain life and wasted time. Do not blame yourself for despising people, leading a vulgar life. Jai Jixu put on her red and black robe and headed out, waving and smiling at the main character. The girl walked in the rain with an umbrella and a book. At some point she stopped, looking up. The rain fell noisily on the paved road as Jai Jixu stood silent. Words were spinning in her head that she had a purpose. She looked at the cover of the book about the Will of Steel, which showed a mechanism with gears. The girl opened the book and began to read the lines from there. The pages of the book began to glow, emitting blue dust. The raindrops seemed to become diamonds, letting light pass through them. The water was divided into smaller round droplets right in the air. Jai Jixu looked up at the sky in surprise. Her umbrella was closed. The girl's amber yellow eyes were wide open. A large red eye appeared from the raindrops, looking straight at Jai Jixu, who stood with her mouth open. She put her hands under the shiny blue drops of rain. It was written in the book that this is an indestructible steel will, a force acting directly on the soul. She turned her head sharply towards the bookstore. Lin Jai was standing there near the shelves of books. There was a figurine of a gargoyle on his desk. The gargoyle's ears had two hoop-shaped earrings. Near the rosary hanging around the figurine's neck, people's faces seemed to begin to appear. The gray withered people opened their mouths, releasing red dust. One of them was Ryan, who had a growth on his neck. Jai Jixu realized that Highwood's mark had indeed been removed. The realization seemed to pierce her, causing her to be shocked. The red eye above the girl emitted black trails in the shape of spiked tentacles. These tentacles headed straight towards the Lin Jai bookstore. The tentacle wrapped itself around Ryan's neck, who squealed and roared loudly. The limbs moved away from the gargoyle statue and began to return. Suddenly, Jai Jixu's face began to sweat profusely, and she herself experienced a sharp pain. She dropped the book and her legs began to give way. Blood began to flow from her nose, drops falling straight onto the road. Suddenly, Jai Jixu looked more focused and serious. The tentacles brought Ryan to her. The girl grinned and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Ryan opened his mouth in a silent scream as a red translucent trail came out of his mouth. Jai Jixu put her hand on her shoulder and said that everything was as expected from Mr. Lin Jai. She lowered both hands to the level of her stomach and said that the main character easily changed the structure of her soul, filling her body with a huge amount of ether. Now she has the opportunity to break the intimidating level. Jai Jixu began to lower her hands lower, sliding near the belt. The girl blushed and her hands were folded at hip level. She said in amazement that this fulfillment, quickly turning into a feeling of pleasure, was truly wonderful. With a blush on her cheeks, Jai Jixu turned her head to the side, thinking that after receiving such a huge gift, she could say without exaggeration that Mr. Lin Jai gave her a second life. The girl stood in the rain while the sky was covered with leaden clouds. She guessed that Mr. Lin Jai wanted to cultivate his strength in the hunters, and the ever-changing lifestyle of the hunters would provide her with generous assistance. She finally understood what Lin Jai meant. Jai Jixu began to raise her hands to her bloody nose. Despite this, there was a loving smile on her smile, and she herself promised that from now on she would be absolutely faithful to the will and instructions of Mr. Lin Jai. Her body and everything that she had would serve him and his desires. She decided that she would never upset him again. The main character seemed to feel someone's gaze on him while he was sorting through the books. He turned to the glass door and saw Jai Jixu's silhouette there. When the girl realized that Lin Jai was looking at her, she froze in place. After that, Jai Jixu awkwardly bowed in recognition. Then, she hurriedly ran in the opposite direction. The main character didn't understand why she still hadn't left and where this nosebleed came from. The guy turned slightly pale and frowned in confusion. Lin Jai sat down in his chair and fearfully thought that she might be crazy. He realized that when she was abandoned by this idiot, as he believed, she began to come to his bookstore more often. He shook his head from side to side, trying to get the indecent thoughts out of his head. He decided not to jump to conclusions, because Jai Jixu is an incredible woman and she cannot be interested in an ordinary person like her. The main character still needs to figure out a way to attract customers. Suddenly, a new visitor appeared at the doorstep of the bookstore. It was Abraham Joseph, who was looking at the dossier in his hands. He looked at the paper in his hands, saying the name of the street. He took a step forward towards the entrance. Abraham Joseph said that Shady Bookstore is right here. He looked angry and irritated. His teeth were bared, and the man himself sighed displeasedly. He didn't know why the wily old man Frank Wilde came to such a small bookstore, but he couldn't miss the lead on that elderly psycho. He decided that he would only believe it when he saw it with his own eyes, not wanting to trust anyone. On his feet were brown leather boots. Abraham Joseph began to walk towards the door of the bookstore. There was some kind of barrier around him that protected him from the rain. The man said that as a knight, he must bring justice. The main character noticed a book with a blue cover and took it. He sat in his chair with one leg crossed over the other and took out a book. Lin Jai ran his hand over the cover, which said that this was a book about the little prince. The guy hummed something under his breath, thinking that this fairy tale, full of philosophy, is really good. It tells about gentle and sweet stories and good principles. This book will be today's bedtime story. Unexpectedly for the main character, the bell rang, signaling a new visitor. Lin Jai turned his head towards the open door in surprise. A happy smile appeared on his face, enjoying his guest and wondering what a wonderful day it was today. He decided that Jai Jixu was indeed a carp, because karm is considered a lucky talisman and a symbol of good luck. Because someone remembered the girl, she sneezed. The formidable Abraham Joseph entered the bookstore, dressed in a dark green formal suit. Lin Jai turned to him, realizing that he sensed ill will from the new guest. Despite this, the main character greeted Abraham Joseph and asked how he could help him. Lin Jai said that he would be able to read, borrow or buy books. Abraham Joseph began to look around the store. A star appeared in his left pupil, and his iris turned purple. With the help of this eye, he seemed to scan the room, and realized that this was indeed an ordinary bookstore. There is no ether vibration in the entire store. The wooden shelves were almost bursting with the number of different books. Lin Jai looked slightly worried, a bead of sweat running down his cheek. Abraham Joseph decided that it was not worth wasting time asking about Frank Wilde, because he assumed that the young man knew nothing. Now everything was clear to him at a glance. The only oddity seemed to him to be the figurine of a gargoyle. A fire-shaped aura appeared behind Abraham Joseph as he looked at the Lin Jai figurine. The man thought that Frank Wilde would not give such a meaningless gift like this, so he decided that there was a deep meaning in it. Abraham Joseph turned to the main character and coldly asked if he was the owner of this bookstore. Lin Jai began to think about the answer. He realized that this guest was not talkative. First, he needed to address him in a friendly manner, keeping his distance. He decided to call him uncle, believing that he would not be mistaken. Lin Jai smiled at the man and, calling him uncle, answered in the affirmative. This appeal shocked and even upset Abraham Joseph. His gaze became empty and uncomprehending. The man thought that if the young knight addressed him like that, he would break his head. He imagined himself in luxurious knightly armor made of gold and silver. If Lin Jai were not an ordinary person, he would definitely be in trouble. Abraham Joseph placed his hands aggressively on the table, lowering his head and frowning. He looked at the main character angrily. The man pointed to a gargoyle with its mouth wide open and asked if it belonged to him. Lin Jai remained calm. He turned a little to Abraham Joseph and replied that this souvenir was given to him by one of his clients and it was not for sale. A fire seemed to flare up in the man's eyes. He thought about what he was not going to buy, because why would he, a great knight, buy a gargoyle made by an evil dark magician? Abraham Joseph tiredly closed his eyes and opened his mouth slightly. He put his prosthetic on the table and thought that if the gargoyle did not break, then he made it durable. The man asked if Frank Wilde was his client. The main character tensed a little, but answered affirmatively. He wondered if this uncle knew Frank Wilde, and given their relationship, if he and Frank Wilde could be enemies. Suddenly, Abraham Joseph became thoughtful. He put his hand to his chin and closed one eye. He thought about how that old mole could reveal his real name, and also give a gargoyle of such a level to an ordinary person. The man believed from the very beginning that this place was a stronghold of dark magicians, but this young man is completely ordinary. Frank Wilde looked puzzled, which caused Lin Jai to question. The man decided to assume that this was a secret code for the connection. That is, it was just a place for communication. Suddenly, a realization hit Lin Jai, who, as usual, interpreted everything in his own way. He decided that based on his experience with people, although this uncle was aggressive, he did not seem like a bad person. Moreover, despite his extremely strong aura, he did not break a single item upon entering the store. If you look closely, he is a careful and gentle person. Abraham Joseph looked slightly annoyed at the ceiling and wondered why. The main character decided that such a person had no reason to quarrel with the harmless linguist Frank Wilde. Holmes said that when all options have been eliminated, the remaining answer is the truth, no matter how outrageous the answer may be. Lin Jai believed that in such a case there was only one answer. The main character turned to Abraham Joseph and asked him if he and Mr. Abraham Joseph were friends. This question outraged the man terribly. Snot even started flowing from his nose. He tiredly lowered his head and closed his eyes, leaning on the table, and replied that so be it. He said that he had known that old man for many years. They were old acquaintances. The man opened his mouth slightly, revealing snow-white teeth. Abraham Joseph raised his hand and said that they could be called true friends, but 2 years ago they quarreled and parted without saying goodbye, and until recently there was no news of him. He himself thought inside that he would find this bag of sand, meaning Frank Wilde, and would not be afraid to tear off his head, crushing his insides. He imagined literally hitting a sandbag. Although it was almost 2 years ago, Abraham Joseph wished that his enemy had died. Lin Jai imagined the two drinking tea together, and thought that he did not even expect that the relationship between these two old men would be so close. He thought it was touching, so he even wiped a tear from his eyes. The main character put his hand on the wing of the gargoyle and said that now it is not surprising that Abraham Joseph realized at one glance that this thing belonged to Mr. Frank Wilde. He believed that this was truly an enviable friendship and Frank Wilde would certainly be touched to learn about it. Abraham Joseph turned his back on Lin Jai and the statue, saying that it would be nice if he knew, because the man had been looking for his traces all these years. He looked calmer than before. Abraham Joseph said that he didn't know if Frank Wilde had left his address, but if Lin Jai gave it to him, he could visit him in person. The main character poured tea from a white teapot. He replied that he would tell him, but he himself did not know his address. The guy said that Mr. Frank Wilde took the book a few days ago, and it would be some time before he returned. He placed a cup of tea in front of Abraham Joseph and offered to wait for Frank Wilde to return while he told the man about his uncle. He asked if the man wanted to sit down and rest. Lin Jai himself sat down at the table and asked if the man wanted to look at the book first. Abraham Joseph sighed wearily, narrowing his eyes, and asked if he looked so decrepit that the guy suggested he rest. He stood near the table, crossing his arms over his chest, and thought that, faced with eccentricity, the guy could still calmly entertain the guest. He wondered how many people dared to talk to him so casually since he became a great knight. Every day they asked him how he was doing and said hello. Therefore, Abraham Joseph decided that a little rest would not hurt him. He put his hand on the back of the chair, pushing it away. The man closed one eye and placed his other hand on the table. He said that you shouldn't overestimate old people. Standing a little is enough to get tired. But if the guy wants him to sit down and just drink tea, then that won't do. Regarding books, he replied that he did not like to read and he did not have money with him. Lin Jai smiled and thought about the touchy and cold girl, and thought that there was something in it. As soon as the man spoke, the main character realized that he looked like this type of girl. The guy took a cup of tea in his hands and said that there was no charge for reading in the bookstore, only in the library behind him. He suggested warming up with a cup of tea first. Abraham Joseph sweated a little and closed his eye. He said that there was no need for books. He would sit for a while and go. He was bothered by a headache, which happened more and more often. The man touched the book that stood on the table to his right with his elbow. He noticed this, tensed. It was a book with a little demon on the cover called Son of the Abyss. Lin Jai looked at the man friendly and said that he was just reading a very touching and healing fairy tale, and suggested that he take a look. He advised me to read a fairy tale before bed, because it relieves stress very well. Abraham Joseph took a cup of tea in his hands and said that this was ridiculous and childish. He said that the guy was no longer a child, so he asked why he still liked reading such books. Lin Jai thought that the man's tone was instructive, but the guy himself didn't know whether he was young or not. The main character sighed in frustration and said that he was sorry. He showed the book about the little prince to the man and said that this was the best fairy tale he had ever read, it in a single copy. Abraham Joseph saw a book about the Son of the Abyss. He angrily pointed his finger at the fairy tale and asked if he was talking about this book now. Lin Jai, a little embarrassed and confused, put the book to his chest and replied that it was a very good collection of fairy tales and an absolute classic. In his hands was a book with a blue cover about the little prince. Abraham Joseph did not agree with him, because no one would read a fairy tale called The Son of the Abyss before going to bed. The man looked discouraged and confused. His gaze became blank. He looked intensely at Lin Jai sitting opposite him, a heavy atmosphere hovering around him. He thought that this was his fairy tale for the bright world of dreams, and this inexplicable so-called fairy tale turns out to be very intriguing. Abraham Joseph extended his hand to Lin Jai and asked him to take a look. He awkwardly averted his gaze and asked not to be misunderstood. According to him, he was not at all interested in this ghostly tale. He said he would take a look just to satisfy his desire to recommend the book. The main character imagined in his head a Chinese man smoking a cigar. Lin Jai thought that the rude gentleman was not deceiving him. The more fierce he was on the outside, the more gentle he was on the inside. He handed Abraham Joseph the book, thinking that he should succumb to the charm of the fairy tale. As soon as the man picked up the book, he seemed to start shaking. He felt a hot tingling sensation and dizziness. Cold sweat began to run down his face and his hands shook. Abraham Joseph began to fall from his chair to the floor, as if the magic sword Candela, which he had imagined earlier, appeared in front of him. He didn't understand why it started now. Suddenly he realized that the guy had just said that this was a bedtime story. He didn't think this could be a dream. His eyes began to close as he held his hand in front of him. Lin Jai looked at the man with excitement. Abraham Joseph felt his body begin to grow heavy. Everything around him plunged into darkness. The main character jumped up from his chair and looked at the falling Abraham Joseph, asking what happened. He ran towards the man, not understanding what was happening. Various alarming possibilities were running through his mind, like a stroke and a sudden cerebral hemorrhage. Lin Jai sat down on the floor next to the man, extending his hand towards him. He touched his neck, thinking that first he needed to provide first aid and then call an ambulance. Abraham Joseph lay on his back with his eyes closed and his mouth slightly open. Suddenly something confused Lin Jai while he was feeling the man's neck. He felt his even breathing and strong heartbeat. Abraham Joseph was simply fast asleep, snoring. The main character smiled with relief and exhaled, saying that the man's pulse was stronger than his, even though the guy was younger. He added that his uncle is still very healthy. However, Lin Jai still didn't understand why he suddenly lost consciousness. The guy was on one knee, his head was sweating a lot. He understood that this could not be because of his book. The main character believed that there must be a reason that when looking at the book The Little Prince in this world, one suddenly becomes dizzy and faints. The guy grabbed his head and lowered the corners of his lips. He said that eventually people had fainted here before. Lin Jai rose to his feet and sighed as he looked at the man. He decided to first put him on the bed and wait for his uncle to wake up, and then he would question him. The main character was breathing heavily and his face was sweating heavily. He hardly grabbed Abraham Joseph by the armpits and tried to lift him, simultaneously emitting a heavy groan. He strained greatly in trying to drag the man onto the bed, so he closed his eyes. The main character tried to move the old man at least a little, but nothing worked. He got down on all fours, breathing heavily, and said that he expected his uncle to be heavy, but he couldn't even imagine that he was that heavy. He looked disappointed and upset, thinking that Abraham Joseph had muscles of steel like a bear. He imagined a man with the body of a large bear. The main character sat on the floor and looked at Abraham Joseph, saying that it would be nice if he were as skinny as Frank Wilde. He didn't know what to do now. It would be nice if other customers would come and help. The problem is that in such terrible weather no one will come, and it will be too late. He clasped his palms in front of him and mentally apologized for what he would have to do. Lin Jai reached for the man's chest with his hands. He grabbed with his hands the black cloak that Abraham Joseph was wearing. The room was dark. The main character was still able to drag the man away in this way. From behind the door, a black cat looked at what was happening, her eyes widening in surprise. The main character was able to place Abraham Joseph on the couch, but it was difficult for him. The metal prosthesis hit the wooden bed and made a ringing sound. Lin Jai heard this, so he looked surprised. The mechanical prosthesis had an entire body made of silver-colored metal, but there were gold parts. He was surprised to realize that this man, like Frank Wilde, was disabled. The main character clasped his hands, his mouth slightly open. He sat down on the floor, leaning against the cot. Lin Jai understood that ordinary people should not use such a precision mechanical prosthesis. In addition, the man had an amazingly powerful physique and incredible energy. Realization came to the main character quite quickly. He looked at the sleeping Abraham Joseph and decided that he was in fact a retired senior officer. He imagined a menacing image of a man in his head, after which he remembered that he was similar to the retired officer with whom he had previously interacted, both of whom had an innate firmness and impartiality. Lin Jai looked at Abraham Joseph's serene sleeping face and thought that he was cruel and exhausted due to the PTSD that appeared after the war. The main character turned his gaze to the mechanical prosthesis and decided that he had lost his arm on the battlefield. Such old people are usually the most stubborn and stubborn. For Lin Jai, it was no wonder why he was so cold. Looking at the metal hand, he frowned in surprise. Now everything was clear to him. As far as he knows, due to moisture, a short circuit easily occurs between the connections of the metal joint and the mechanical limb. The main character stood in front of the window, watching the rain. The guy decided that the man lost consciousness for this reason. If it was an accidental electric shock, then it must have affected the nervous system. He again approached the cot where Abraham Joseph lay. Suddenly his gaze became intense and thoughtful. He looked the other way and thought that on the other hand, this situation made him feel like he was doing something strange. He felt like a butcher who had just killed a man on a dark rainy night, and then dragged the corpse into a dark store to do immoral things while hiding the truth. He grabbed his head, imagining in his head an evil bandit with a knife in his hand. The main character decided that he has too rich an imagination and shouldn't think about it. He shook his head from side to side, as if trying to shake such thoughts out of himself. He grabbed his chest with his left hand and realized that even if this situation is misleading, he, Lin Jai, is a kind and honest person who is not afraid of slander. The door to the room was slightly open, letting in some light. A black cat with yellow eyes peeked out from behind the door again, looking scared. Lin Jai looked again at his unconscious visitor. He noticed that the man had a book in his hand. The main character thought that he liked the book so much that he did not let it go, even after losing consciousness. Lin Jai smiled faintly and sighed. He turned to the man and good-naturedly told him that even strong people can have sweet dreams like a fairy tale. He wished him a good night's sleep. Suddenly a strange sound sounded, attracting the guy's attention. He looked towards the front door and asked who was there. Near the slightly open door there was a black mark left by a cat's paw. Lin Jai went outside where it was still raining. He looked to his right and saw a cat running away, meowing. The main character smiled and said that it was just a cat. Lin Jai looked around the corner and waved to the cat, advising him to be careful and return home. The black cat ran scared as fast as he could down the street. He started swearing out loud. The cat stopped in the middle of the road and tried to catch his breath. He began to shake, clearing drops of water from his fur. The cat opened its mouth wide and looked back in fear. He had a black mustache and a small black nose. The cat abruptly canceled the transformation. The animal gradually began to take on a human appearance. He was a guy with shoulder-length black hair and freckles on his cheeks. It was Greg Morrison, an investigator from the Secret Tower's intelligence department. Greg Morrison began to cry, asking why and how this happened. He was the #1 admirer of the knight Abraham Joseph. In order to get closer to his idol, he tried his best to enter the intelligence department of the Secret Tower. Greg Morrison looked excited as the reception took place in the tower. Of course, regarding the past affairs between the great knight Abraham Joseph and the dark magician Frank Wilde, he was also aware of this. The guy then sat until late and read information about it. Out of curiosity and concern about the idol, he carefully followed Mr. Abraham Joseph to this bookstore. That is why he turned into a cat and followed him into the room. Greg Morrison never thought this could happen. In the form of a cat, he went outside and began to rejoice that there was no magical reaction, which means that this is just an ordinary bookstore. He decided to wait and try to get an autograph from Mr. Abraham Joseph. 10 minutes passed. The cat sat outside and continued to get wet in the rain. He sighed and looked inside, thinking that Sir Abraham Joseph was so slow, and wondering why he still hadn't come out. He decided to just look, but not only because he wants to gawk at the heroic Abraham Joseph. His big yellow eyes reflected the man's fall. Greg Morrison opened his mouth in horror, not understanding what happened and why Sir Abraham Joseph, who had just been talking and laughing, suddenly fell. He discreetly looked at the bookstore through the slightly open door. Greg Morrison did not know who this young man was or if some kind of dark magic was used. He tried to remain unnoticed, so he tried to hide behind the front door. You could see fear and excitement on Greg Morrison's cat-like face. He watched Lin Jai standing by the window and saying a phrase about dreams, wishing for a peaceful sleep. The cat felt as if there was an eerie shadow of a terrible beast behind Lin Jai. Drops of water ran down Greg Morrison's fur. He suggested that the protagonist wants the unrivaled sacred flame to go into sleep forever. He accidentally touched a can with his paw, which made a noise. He realized that Lin Jai had noticed him, which is why he frowned and decided to run away. When the bookstore owner came outside, Greg Morrison was already running down the street in horror. He wanted to get away from this store and understood that the guy was not someone he could deal with now. He was very scared. Lin Jai's lips moved smoothly as he advised him to be careful and return home. Greg Morrison, already in human form, hid behind a trash can and was shaking with fear. He cried and whimpered, asking if this was a feeling of near death. He said that the man could have caught him, but he let him go. In his opinion, Lin Jai wants him to go back and report. Greg Morrison's cheeks and nose were very red, snot was running from his nostrils, and tears were flowing from his eyes. He turned into a cat again and ran down the street, saying that he had no choice, and now he could only come back and report it. The service life is currently only 1 year. Greg Morrison frowned at his muzzle, which was wet from the rain. He mentally asked Abraham Joseph to wait. Now he has an extremely serious mission. Abraham Joseph opened his eyes with a long sigh. He couldn't figure out where he was, even though there were bubbles in the air behind him. He found himself in the hallucination of that magical sword Candela again. Suddenly Abraham Joseph realized that he was free, and the illusion did not hurt him. He frowned and gritted his teeth as a red light appeared in front of him. An unknown voice in his head said that people who peer into the abyss will in the future find themselves under the close surveillance of the abyss and recognized by it. A huge book appeared in front of him, with dark purple footprints coming out of it. Abraham Joseph realized that this was the text written in that so-called fairy tale. He closed his eyes and clenched his mechanical hand into a fist. He asked to stop the words directed at his head, because it would explode. The man put both hands on his head. A huge magical sword appeared behind him, emitting red light. An unknown voice said it was great to finally see him again. The sword stood directly in front of the book, and Abraham Joseph realized that the feeling of pain was gradually going away. He assumed that just now it was the emotions of the magic sword that was rejoicing. A hand in gold and white armor rushed towards Abraham Joseph. The man looked straight ahead in surprise, and golden hair floated nearby. A man in knight's armor stood with his back in front of him with a sword in his left hand. He had long blonde hair. He looked closely at the hilt of the sword, which was made of gold. The man had snow-white skin and elven ears. Abraham Joseph thought that such a wonderful fairy tale really needs to be shown to children. He suddenly opened his eyes, waking up in the real world. He stood up slightly from his bed with a frightened face, holding the book Son of the Abyss in his hands. The man looked at the fairy tale in his hands without saying anything. He sat down on the edge of the bed. Lin Jai noticed this. The main character smiled at him and asked if he was awake. Abraham Joseph began to open his mouth slightly, revealing his snow-white teeth. He looked at Lin Jai with a slight smile and thanked him. The man put his hand on the table and thanked him again. The main character answered him with a light and calm smile that he had to do it. The guy asked how he was feeling. Abraham Joseph rose from his cot to his feet, still holding the book in his hands. He smiled excitedly and clenched his mechanical hand into a fist, saying that he felt great, better than ever. Lin Jai closed his eyes, smiling, and looked at Abraham Joseph's muscular arm and thought that now his strength is like a beast. No one will even believe that he is a retired military man. It seems that his gaze is becoming more and more accurate, worthy of him. Seeing his uncle's posture and physique now, Lin Jai was afraid that one blow from him could be fatal. He made a thoughtful face and put his fist to his chin. He thought that if Frank Wilde's weak body received such a blow, he would simply shatter into pieces. The main character was glad that the two were friends, but he did not know about their real relationship. Abraham Joseph closed his eyes and turned his head away. He said he was ashamed that he was just sitting there, but he got so much help. Lin Jai smiled at him. Another book lay on his lap. He asked him not to be shy, because he had said something similar to Frank Wilde before. Lin Jai said that they are his clients, so it is his duty to help them. The man closed his eyes and lowered his head, smiling faintly. He understood his thinking style. He must help the customers. In other words, the bookstore owner has a neutral position. He helps the client, no matter what kind of person he is. The main character put one leg on his chest and put his hands on his knee. Abraham Joseph realized that as long as he could enter his store, he would be his client and the object that the guy would help. The implementation of such kindness at one's own request by the knight of the video is only available to one species, the elves. They are a long-lived, graceful, and full of wisdom race. Abraham Joseph introduced two beautiful elves, behind whom Lin Jai stood with his back. He believed that if the owner of the store is one of the elves, then everything becomes logical. Only a long life could make him lose the desire to distinguish between good and evil in detail, turning his attention to the desire for new pleasures. The image of Lin Jai in his head was starting to become darker against the background of the elf in a bikini. Abraham Joseph believed that this warm and tactful manner of addressing people, calmness and grace, was the result of a very long life. As for the bookstore, it is the embodiment of the elves' respect for knowledge. Nowadays, people are not particularly interested in literature. In the man's mind, Lin Jai had elven ears. The main character looked straight with red eyes that seemed to sparkle. In addition, there are legends that have been passed down from mouth to mouth for thousands of years. The man imagined the thin lips of a handsome man. This was Kandela, the prince of the ancient elven kingdom, and after the elven king of the moon. He was also known as the original source of the Great Pandemic and the first madman. He imagined Kandela standing on a rock with his magic sword against the backdrop of a crescent moon. He killed himself with his own sword, imprisoning his soul in it. Kandela pierced his chest with a blade, blood flowed from it. The soul became a curse, making the sword with the same name as the prince magical. The sword with a beautiful golden hilt seemed to be on fire. People with pained faces were drawn to him. Since then, every owner of the sword dies, going crazy. Abraham Joseph looked shocked. He could not even think that the book could calm the magic sword Kandela. He placed his fist on the book and wondered if the shopkeeper who had such a book with him could be someone other than an elf. In his opinion, an elf who has such a book must definitely be an old monster who has lived for centuries, which means that he used all his magical power to prolong his life. Naturally, there is not a drop of ether in his body. Abraham Joseph's hand was shaking. The main character looked at him questioningly. The man made a serious face and extended his hand forward. He said that Lin Jai said that there was only one copy of this book, and that he really liked reading it. He asked if he could take the book in that case. Lin Jai realized that he was no longer able to tear himself away. This was the best decision when working with such a cold person. The guy smiled softly and friendly and answered in the affirmative, because if the book could not be taken, he would not recommend it to him. The moment of healing through conversation has arrived. Lin Jai raised his finger and said that he knew at first glance that this book was right for him. Abraham Joseph looked puzzled, his eyes blank and his mouth slightly open. The main character said that a lot of people suffer, like a man. The emergence in the soul of such things is melancholy and regret. The feeling of a lack of one's own strength makes one doubt oneself and ultimately drives one crazy. The guy knew that people who have been on the battlefield often worry about the mistakes they made. Lin Jai and Abraham Joseph sat at the table, looking at each other. The main character understood that this war trauma, which accompanies them all their lives, can be called very painful and tiring. Lin Jai put on a serious face and folded his hands in front of him, saying that they never lost to torture, they were defeated by their own cowardly kindness. Abraham Joseph remembered two magic sword wielders who went crazy and were covered in blood. Their final regret was their own lack of strength. The man frowned and gritted his teeth, asking if it was wrong to be kind. Lin Jai crossed his arms and closed his eyes. He replied that kindness was good, but the key word was cowardly. The main character raised his gaze and looked seriously at the man, answering that due to the high expectations of other people, arising from their own integrity and sense of responsibility, wanting to help and give as much confidence to others as possible, they seem indestructible to themselves. But in reality the defense is extremely fragile. Abraham Joseph lowered his head and looked at the table with a blank look. Lin Jai added that this kindness can save others, but not himself. Once the soul dies, anything can take its place. These words surprised Abraham Joseph a little, who raised his eyebrows. The main character frowned and advised to be an ordinary person sometimes. There is no need to mistake yourself for an all-powerful hero, to escape successfully, and not to destroy yourself. On the contrary, a kind of courage. In fact, he smiled slyly in his head, mentally saying that he gave him custom-made wisdom and should not be afraid to succumb to feelings. Abraham Joseph began to tremble as realization dawned on him. It was not because the curse of the magic sword was extremely strong, but because of the soul's excessive desire for perfection. It became contaminated. He was angry that it took so long for anyone to figure it out. The man's fist on the table began to shake. Abraham Joseph asked how long this would last after calming down. The main character smiled with embarrassment and bewilderment. He thought that it couldn't be that. In addition to such a useful fairy tale, a psychologist was also needed. Lin Jai began to move his thin lips and responded negatively. He placed one hand on the table and raised his other hand. He said that if he was willing to let someone help him, he would guarantee a long-term effect. The main character believed that in this way, the guest with the need for a long-term solution to his psychological problem would not return soon. Abraham Joseph sweated and tensed, and he abruptly stood up from his chair. He asked what the store owner said. The man thought that the main character wanted to voluntarily take upon himself the insane curse of the Candela sword. He remembered unknown people who had discussed that Abraham Joseph was indeed the longest-lived of all the owners of the magic sword. They believed that this was all because he decided to fall before the sword desecrated him. Abraham Joseph stood near the light in the shape of a cross. Evil tongues said that the invincible sacred flame used to frighten, but not now. They assumed that he wanted to take the opportunity to go down before the magic sword could blacken him. Now Abraham Joseph thought that perhaps he was lucky in that he had let things go. He clenched his mechanical hand into a fist. After that, he relaxed his prosthetic, thinking that this sword had found a true successor. Abraham Joseph's broad back straightened, and he asked if the main character was sure, because he might suffer difficulties, it would not be so easy to cope with it. Lin Jai smiled and closed his eyes. He thought that Abraham Joseph was truly a worthy friend of Frank Wilde. He and this uncle were such good-natured people. The guy put his finger to his lips, trying to calm down, because he is a professional life mentor. The main character put his hands on the table and asked Abraham Joseph if there was any difficulty that he was currently unable to cope with. The man became shocked when Lin Jai told him that he could give him this book if needed. Abraham Joseph froze with his mouth slightly open, saying nothing. The main character looked at him and said that he was carrying too heavy a load all the time. He suggested that he get some rest, just like other heroes like him. The man's eyes opened wide and his eyebrows dropped slightly. He looked at the guy who raised his hands. Abraham Joseph believed that what a selfless and noble quality the protagonist has. In his opinion, only an immortal can so strive for good that goes beyond common sense. In his eyes, Lin Jai was surrounded by a golden and warm light. The man grinned, revealing his white teeth. He was filled with hope and motivation. Abraham Joseph clenched his fist and said that the only way to talk about rest was until there was peace in the world. He stood up from his chair and looked towards Lin Jai, saying that he needed to think for a while. He asked if he could borrow the book for a couple of days, saying that he would be back in a week. The main character put his palm on the table and said that he could take it. He just needed to register the basic information. He turned his back to the man and grinned. He thought that the burden of a retired military man's sense of justice was indeed quite painful. Apparently, in the future he would become a regular customer. The main character took out a card from his store where he wrote the name of the book. He asked for a cash deposit, after which he could take the book. Just need to write the name and date. If he does not want to borrow the book again, he will return half of the deposit. Abraham Joseph picked up the card and began to write down the information, realizing that this was after all a bookstore. He took a closer look at the store's logo, printed on yellowish paper. The man frowned and concentrated his gaze on the sheet. Lin Jai picked up a book with a black cover and said that they would see each other in a week. Abraham Joseph, holding the book he had taken in his hands, headed towards the exit. As he walked towards the door, he felt all his worries go away. The man raised his head and took a deep breath, then exhaled. Now all he can do is stick and stand up for what is right. Stepping outside, a blue force field appeared around Abraham Joseph. He said that Frank Wilde survived. He was helped by the owner of the bookstore, but this does not matter, because he will kill him with his own hands. Abraham Joseph believed that this was his responsibility and work that he needed to do. The man stood in the rain while his body was protected from the water. In the back streets of the city, in a gateway, there was a door behind which was a bright green light. This was Frank Wilde's house. He was in his office, in which there were many books, and above Frank Wilde himself there was a huge ceiling, which emitted a green light. The man's green eyes also glowed and he frowned. He said that the breadth of knowledge is truly as vast as the sea, deep and incomprehensible like a gorge, worthy of Mr. Lin Jai. Frank Wilde laughed madly, holding a fountain pen with ink in his hands. He grabbed his head, which hurt, but he smiled widely and said that he was really excited. He placed his hands on the table, where there was a sheet of pentagrams and various symbols. Frank Wilde said that this is such a crazy and dangerous ritual, and also surprisingly compatible with rationality. It was a strange and great achievement for him. Frank Wilde looked up from the table and looked to the right, thinking that the time had come. On the wall hung his mask, which had the texture of snake skin on it. He said that the black faceless one would soon recreate Nazim. Frank Wilde grabbed his face and started smiling madly. He believed that if the devil's tongue was the tip of the iceberg, only a small part, then the rituals of the corpse eaters finally allowed him to contemplate this terrible lost civilization. He put on a black mask, thinking it was majestic and charming. This is all thanks to Mr. Lin Jai. He has already prepared a gift that he will definitely like. Claude threw sheets of paper, a notebook and a pen into the air. The guy aggressively started shaking Greg Morrison in the form of a cat and asked if the teacher was really standing in that bookstore, and then suddenly fell. Greg Morrison was shaking with stress and showed his thumb in the affirmative. Claude asked how this was possible. He leaned on the table, still holding Greg Morrison in his right hand. He believed that it was necessary to gather people and almost help, but he immediately decided that now it was impossible to act rashly, even if it was the teacher Abraham Joseph. In his opinion, the slightest mistake will lead to even greater losses, the consequences of which will be unimaginable. Suddenly the phone on his desk started ringing. He excitedly picked up the phone and asked the interlocutor what happened to the man sent to investigate that bookstore and what the situation was. Claude put the phone to his ear and began to silently wait for an answer. A joyful smile appeared on his face because he heard that the teacher had left. He hung up the call of his interlocutor and pressed the button. After this, the phone received a call from Abraham Joseph, who addressed Claude by name. The guy responded immediately, his face looking worried. Abraham Joseph stood on the street, holding the phone in his hand. He asked if they had orders. The man put his metal hand in his pocket and firmly ordered the withdrawal of intelligence from 23rd Street. His lips barely moved. He said that this store belongs to an area of indescribable level, top secret rank. Claude heard this and was shocked. He could not answer. A list of levels appeared in his head: abnormal, frightening, destructive, and, most recently, indescribable. The guy raised his eyebrows, a drop of sweat running down his face. He asked the teacher what happened and wanted to find out information about the owner of the bookstore. Suddenly, Abraham Joseph noticed something, causing him to stop talking. He saw 3 kittens who were getting wet in the rain, sitting on the road. Abraham Joseph asked Claude if there was anyone near him. Claude was slightly taken aback and answered in the affirmative. He thought that, judging by his tone, the teacher was slightly angry. He grabbed Greg Morrison by the neck, causing him to foam at the mouth. Claude put the cat on the table and hit his neck with his palm. The guy asked the teacher for forgiveness for acting without thinking. 3 kittens surrounded the man and fell under his protective field. Abraham Joseph asked Claude why he still hadn't shut his mouth and started working if he knew he had messed up. He asked if he wanted to be sent north to the mountains growing potatoes. Claude immediately began to shake his head from side to side, answering in the negative. He said that he would give the order right away. The guy hung up the call and looked at the phone, thinking that the teacher was speaking as if he was not in danger, but he was still of the old school. 2 men in brown raincoats stood in the rain. Next to him stood a guy with a burgundy raincoat with a phone in his hand. Claude thought that even though starting a fire and breaking other people's heads is terrible, as long as he helps him, everything will be done properly. It is a sharp tongue combined with a soft heart, the morality of a great knight. This is the style of his highly respected teacher Abraham Joseph. A man walked in the rain, taking black kittens with him. Claude raised his head. The interlocutor told him that the above is how he understands the situation. The guy replied that this is the dossier that the great knight Abraham Joseph demands to be created. Surely the elders will understand the current situation. He removed the phone from his ear when the other person replied that he would immediately approve the creation of a new dossier. Claude thanked him and then disconnected the call. The guy told the teacher that the new dossier had already been approved. He would need to fill it out in person as soon as he returned. Suddenly, Abraham Joseph entered the room and answered in the affirmative. This scared Claude. The man took off his coat and praised the guy for his work. He asked who was just next to him and reminded him to use the brand of oblivion. Claude completely forgot about the cat Greg Morrison, who was dizzy. He took him by the scruff of the neck and showed him to the man, saying that this was their intelligence officer named Greg Morrison, who came from a family of magicians with great transformation abilities. He said that Greg Morrison is also a fan of his. He has attended 12 Invincible Flame fan conventions and spends about 300 million on various support events every year, including last year's Abraham Joseph Golden Name event. The man sat down at the computer while Claude held Greg Morrison by the scruff of the neck and said that he could be considered the main fan. Abraham Joseph began to type something, tapping on the keyboard. Claude approached the man's desk. Abraham Joseph asked if Greg Morrison did this and if the magic families really had money. Claude answered yes to everything. The boss looked at the monitor screen and said that it would be better if he presented this money to the idol instead of spending money on meaningless things. Abraham Joseph grinned and lowered his thick eyebrows, offering to simply pay under the pretext of recruiting for the training of adept knights. Then the costs of close communication would be to his liking. In the man's opinion, Claude was angry with him inside because he did not understand how such a person, who passionately desires wealth, could be a great knight, and he cheats even a child out of money. He could not express this to the boss's face, so he replied that he would certainly organize everything. Looking at the monitor, Abraham Joseph grinned and said that even the erased memory was preserved. The monitor read, Zone Indescribable Level 113, Nazin, 23rd Street, House 412, Bookstore. Danger Level, Friendly, Contact is not recommended. Confidentiality Level, Top Secret, Ongoing Investigation. Description: it seems that the owner of the bookstore prolongs life, runs this bookstore in solitude, selling books, literature containing mystical and powerful power. Abraham Joseph pressed the enter key. He crossed his arms and thought about how this top secret dossier should warn everyone who saw it to stay away from that bookstore. He believed that if someone saw this dossier and still wanted to play with death, then he could only wish that idiot good luck. After some time, the man was already at home. Someone called him, and he shouted to the interlocutor that everything was fine with him and he was not dead. He asked if he had downloaded all the archived data. He was wearing pink pajamas with pictures of rabbits. The man asked his interlocutor if he had eyes and said that if he died, they must have really pissed him off. Abraham Joseph hung up the phone and said that Claude was in for trouble tomorrow. The man opened the notebook and said that the magic sword was still in a peaceful, joyful state. His psychological changes do not appear to be related to the book's effects. The phone rang again, distracting Abraham Joseph from his work. He clenched his hand into a fist and began to get angry. He shouted that the law on the new workforce, which came out 2 months before the truth meeting, was supposed to bring him profit, and also compensation for moral damage from a poorly working idiot. His daughter Melissa came into the room, as evidenced by the creaking floorboards, and Abraham Joseph reminded her to drink milk. She looked at him shyly, blushing slightly, and said that she knew. Melissa had long curly pink hair and was wearing strawberry pajamas. The daughter said that she is not a small child. Now she is already the captain of the knights from the abnormal level fighting department, and she does not need to remind her of this all the time. Abraham Joseph stood with his back to her, looking towards the window, and said that he was asking her to drink milk in order to make her taller. Otherwise she would definitely not get married. These words seemed to stab the girl right in the heart, causing her to frown. Melissa crossed her arms over her chest and began to get angry. She called her father an old man with a head overgrown with muscles. Suddenly she noticed a book on her father's table. Melissa was a little embarrassed and tense because she didn't understand how this muscular old man could read a book. It seems she has never seen him read. She extended her hand towards the book with an ominous aura. Melissa opened the book and began to read an excerpt from it. Without saying anything, she began flipping through the pages. After a while, she began flipping through the pages even faster. Her eyes were glued to the lines of the book. Suddenly, her pupils constricted in shock and surprise. Abraham Joseph went to answer the phone, stamping his slippers, and ordered him to stop bothering him. He opened his mouth wide, spraying saliva, and shouted that the owner of that bookstore could easily make him lose consciousness without resistance, and if any of them were capable of this, he would open the top secret archive to him. He called them fools who still did not understand, and ordered them not to play with death and remain respectful, otherwise he would not be able to save them. People looking for trouble. Abraham Joseph hit the wall with all his anger. Melissa was still in shock after reading the book. She slammed the book shut and stepped aside. A terrified Melissa walked past her father. Abraham Joseph crossed his arms over his chest and coldly called his daughter's name, causing her to flinch. She turned around with an uncertain face and began to make excuses in a trembling voice. Suddenly her father handed her a glass of milk and reminded her to drink it. His daughter smiled at him, but it was still noticeable that she was angry, and a dark aura seemed to appear behind her. She went into her room, loudly slamming the door behind her. Abraham Joseph put a glass of milk on the table and looked angrily towards her room, saying that it was as if she had begun another puberty. He looked towards the white table with gold details. On the table there was a framed photograph of Abraham Joseph, his wife and little Melissa. The man immediately calmed down and said that as long as she was healthy. Melissa leaned against the door in her room. She did not understand who wrote this book, and whether the main character of the book was really the Elf King Candela, who later became the magic sword Candela. She didn't know why these tales were so impressive. She began to get even angrier, almost crying, and shouted that she had not finished reading yet, but had just stopped at a particularly spectacular moment. The girl fell on her pink pastel and started crying, because she wants to read the sequel. She began to get angry and swear at her father, calling him a fool, devoid of any virtues except strength and beauty. Melissa buried her face in the pillow and sighed sadly, saying that she didn't think that such a conservative person as Dad also read such books. She decided that she was too biased towards him. She lay on her stomach, thinking about everything that had happened. The girl said that based on Dad's phone conversation, the source of this book seems to be a bookstore with a particularly high level of confidentiality. Melissa smiled faintly and frowned, sighing languidly. She said it didn't matter because it was just a bookstore. These powerful conservatives wouldn't go to a place like a bookstore. Melissa brought her hand to her chest, where a blue light began to appear. A blue glowing key appeared in the air above her hand. It was a database key, a level inexplicable access right. Translucent system windows with data from the secret tower appeared in front of the girl. She said that it was enough to use the rights of her mother's account. After all, she was one of the great knights. Melissa put her hands together and exhaled through her nose. She mentally thanked her mother and asked her to wait until she finished reading this story. She would try hard to become an excellent knight and live up to her mother's expectations. She looked through the data window and finally found information about the bookstore. Melissa hugged her knees to her chest as she read the information. She read that the danger level was friendly and said there was nothing interesting here. The girl decided that in this case it wouldn't make a difference if she went and looked. She noticed a glass of milk standing on the table. Melissa puffed out her cheeks and frowned, chuckling. She suddenly grabbed the glass, taking it firmly in her hands. The girl brought the milk to her lips and began to drink in one gulp. She looked at her chest sheepishly, wondering if it had grown. A rain warning sounded, which was upgraded to a red danger category, and the route to the Nazan area was temporarily closed. Currently, all sewer networks are operating at maximum efficiency. Experts predict that if the rains continue for another week, 1/3 of the Nazan area will be completely flooded. The rain came with such force that the water level in the street was greatly increased. The entire paved road was flooded, but the rain did not stop. According to experts, the main reason for the rain this time was cold air masses from the northern mountains. The lights were on in the Lin Jai store. The main character used a mop to remove water that had flowed into his store. He thought that this rain was quite long. It had been going on for more than a week and was getting stronger and stronger. If things continued like this, the guy was afraid that he would leave the house rowing with oars. He moved a mop with a wooden handle across the floor, absorbing excess moisture. Lin Jai stopped to take a breath and wipe the sweat from his face. He said that in such terrible weather there is no point in even mentioning guests, and there are enough problems in ordinary life. Getting up in the morning and seeing a completely flooded floor, he almost decided to move. The main character was glad that the water level did not reach the books and they remained intact. Fortunately, he eventually cleaned up. It was tiring for the guy. After cleaning, the floor became shiny and as if new. Lin Jai looked with pride at the result of the work done. He slightly lifted the sign that said open. After that, he began to carefully wipe the glass door with a rag, thinking about whether that cat, who would actually be Greg Morrison, made it home or not, because in such disgusting weather it is very risky to wander outside. Meanwhile, Greg Morrison was in the Abraham Joseph office. He was incredibly happy to be here, sniffing every inch of the room. Tears of joy appeared in his eyes and he said that this was his paradise. Claude told him to stop it. Lin Jai was still diligently wiping away the stains from the glass. An unknown man hit the wall with his fist in anger. He had a small mustache and cursed angrily at the TV and the rain. It was a fat man with a pillow around his neck who was aggressively banging on the TV. He asked for help, saying this into emptiness. He examined the square TV and thought that everything was in order with the equipment, as well as with the electrical wiring. Then he realized that the problem was the broken traffic jams. He looked at the window where it was raining outside. The man realized that the electrical switch was outside, and in such disgusting weather he didn't want to go outside. He put his fist to his chin and wondered if the guy next door could help him and if he would agree. The man believed that in any case, that guy was always harmless and willingly came to help. He started knocking on Lin Jai's door. The man decided to give him the opportunity and then thank him for his assistance. The man put on a friendly face and asked his neighbor if anyone was home. He stared at the brown wooden door while no one answered him. A few moments later, Lin Jai answered him through the door, asking if he needed any help. The neighbor grinned as soon as he heard the answer. He knelt down on one knee and picked up a book with hearts on the cover and said that there was a problem with his TV. The plugs must have been knocked out. He lied that he had some things to do that he couldn't leave, and asked me to help him go and have a look. On the other side of the door stood the main character. The neighbor told him that the switch was located right next to the back entrance to his store, on the wall on the right side. Lin Jai smiled friendly and agreed, saying that he would go and have a look. Suddenly something made the guy freeze. He lowered his head with a confused look. The main character raised his head and saw a giant shapeless black creature with red eyes. Lin Jai smiled and greeted the creature, affectionately calling it Inkai. He asked if he had business with him or if he had come to hurry him up to borrow a book and leave. Inkai moved quickly, leaving a black trail in the air. The creature stood near the front door and pointed there. Lin Jai pointed his finger at the door and asked if he wanted to say that he would help him. Inkai began to nod in the affirmative. The main character smiled sweetly, closing his eyes. He thought Inkai was a well-mannered cutie. Last time he said that borrowing a book could benefit him. So Lin Jai thought that by appearing now in a new appearance, he decided to help by expressing gratitude. It seemed to the main character that refusal could hurt him now. In the end, he specifically came to help. Lin Jai waved to Inkai and said that he would leave it to him, thanking him. The creature spread out and opened the door slightly, going outside. Inkai crawled to the electrical panel hanging on the wall. With his black hand he turned the lever down. The man who asked for help was sitting in his living room. His TV suddenly turned on. He smiled and threw his head back, thanking him for the help and saying that next time he would help him. Lin Jai stood at the door, raising his head slightly. Inkai slipped through the doors and closed it. The main character replied to the neighbor that he was glad to help. The neighbor was lounging in his chair with a snack in his hands. He said that he was lucky to have a neighbor with a good character, and then decided to continue watching TV. The man looked at the television screen with puffy cheeks. Suddenly something made him open his eyes wide and be surprised. His pupils shrank and tears began to flow from his eyes. He dropped the snack bucket, and an eerie black shadow appeared in front of the TV. These were the antics of Inkai, who decided to scare his neighbor. Lin Jai sat relaxed on his chair with a book in his hand, saying that today is a day of good deeds. With a slight smile on his face, he opened his eyes and thought that business would be more profitable if the owner of the store next door constantly remembered him with kind words, helping him to advance. The bell above the door rang, signaling the entrance of a visitor. With a confused face, the main character greeted the guest. He was surprised that he had just done a good deed and immediately had a new guest. A bandaged hand closed the front door to the store. Frank Wilde entered the room, took off his hat and apologized for disturbing him. Lin Jai smiled at him and extended his hand, asking why he returned so quickly this time. The main character examined Frank Wilde from head to toe and noted that, unlike the mask, his guest's clothes were really good, in the taste of an old gentleman. The guy, without getting up from his chair, said that he deliberately came today in such nasty weather. Lin Jai asked Frank Wilde if the man had any important business with him. Frank Wilde bowed slightly, putting his hat to his chest, and said that given Lin Jai's favor towards him, the weather does not matter. This time he came to formally express his gratitude. The main character pointed to the gargoyle figurine and said that he was quite pleased with the gift he brought last time. The guy added that if this time Frank Wilde intends to give him something valuable, then the guy will have to swear thoroughly before accepting it. The man opened his mouth in surprise, believing that Mr. Lin Jai was comforting him again. Frank Wilde clenched his right hand into a fist. He believed that the insignificant gargoyle was not even close to the gift he had prepared this time. But Mr. Lin Jai still showed modesty by caring about his thinking. Frank Wilde imagined himself in front of a mountain slope. At the same time, he thought that thanks to the guy's gift, he was one step away from the divine level. Only the value of the gift, which he spent 2 years preparing, can be compared with the favor of the protagonist, which he received during this time. Frank Wilde looked straight into Lin Jai's eyes and said that he had no need to hesitate. It had no practical value to him. The man looked away and said that for the main character this could be of great importance, and if he did not accept the gift, then his soul would be unpleasant. Lin Jai crossed one leg over the other and said that it was a little harsh, but he just did some work that wasn't worth the effort. That's all. The main character smiled. Part of his face was covered with dark curls of hair. He said that after such a long conversation, he had no idea what he had prepared, and asked me to let him take a look first. Frank Wilde began to take the item out of his jacket pocket and said that it was a gift that he had spent 2 years preparing. He put the thing on the table and hoped that the guy would like the gift. There was a green and red dream catcher on the table. Lin Jai looked at the offerings slightly uncertainly. He didn't even think that the gift prepared by Frank Wilde would turn out to be a dream catcher. It really brings back memories. A few years ago, before teleporting here, he once participated in a folklore and cultural exhibition. There he found out some information about dream catchers. He was wearing a gray sweatshirt and walked past a merchant who had placed his wares on a mat. A dream catcher is a kind of symbol of Indian culture. The Indians believe that in the middle of the night the air is filled with dreams, and only a dream catcher can drive away bad dreams, attracting good dreams. The seller was dressed in Indian style and was showing a dream catcher. Lin Jai sat in the lotus position opposite the seller. After communicating with that elderly Indian, he learned even more legends about dream catchers. For example, they believed that the beads on dream catchers represented strength and wisdom, intensifying during sound sleep and strengthening people's connection with the spirit world. The main character looked at the gift in surprise and said that he did not think that he would see a dream catcher here again. Frank Wilde looked at him and said that he was truly erudite. The man narrowed his snake-like gaze slightly. He thought that the Indian talisman is a rarely found magical object. The greatest value is not itself, but the dreams inside it. A table lamp illuminated a carefully woven gift for the shop owner. Lin Jai looked at the thing with gratitude. He realized that in terms of precision and overall quality, it was clear that this dream catcher was handmade. In addition, recently the guy began to sleep poorly due to constant downpours. Frank Wilde's best wishes are truly from the bottom of my heart. The main character smiled sincerely and closed his eyes. He said it was just what he needed and thanked his guest. Frank Wilde lowered his sly and cold squint down. The man bowed and put his hand on his chest. He said he was honored to be needed. Frank Wild waved to Lin Jai and began to think that inside the networks there are incomparable beautiful dreams, also fraught with a terrible threat. Without divine-level spiritual power, the soul will be instantly crushed by the dream world. According to Frank Wild, for Mr. Lin Jai, existing at such a high level must be a unique pleasure and pleasure. The man went outside and put on his cylindrical hat, wishing the main character wonderful dreams. The chapel with 2 towers was blown up, and one of the towers began to fall down. Kate fell down along with the building, into which stone fragments flew. The kunai on the chain flew into the air, whistling. The kunai wrapped around Kate's waist, saving her from falling. The girl was able to stand on her weapon and maintain her balance. She thanked Max for her help. The guy asked her to be careful, because he didn't expect a magician to be with them. Kate's weapon dug into the wall, allowing her to stand up straight. Max sat down on one knee and asked her to be careful with her familiar. A thin man in a white robe began to cast a spell in an unknown language. Using his staff, he launched an attack. Jai Jixu ran across the tiled roof with her cane and then began to slide down. Something alarmed her, and she turned her head to the side. She was attacked by a huge green viper which opened its mouth wide. Jai Jixu managed to jump to the side and avoid the beast's attack. The white wolf's paw struck the viper in the upper jaw. The girl gradually began to completely transform into a beast. The green snake's flesh began to tear and blood sprayed out. A white werewolf with glowing eyes tore the viper into 2 parts. The girl's yellow eyes remained even after turning into a wolf. The mage began coughing up blood after the attack, asking how this was possible. His allies approached him. One of them worriedly said that there was indeed a controlled transformation into a beast, and Helix did not tell them. The magician told them not to fuss. Wolf's blood is afraid of flame, and ordered them to prepare saltpeter and sulfur. His ally with tattoos under his eyes said it was raining today. The magician told him that they could handle it, because she was not above the frightening level, and they could defeat her. Jai Jixu's huge paw stepped onto the tile road. The white wolf began to growl against the backdrop of the full moon. She said that the enemies doomed themselves to death. Jai Jixu looked at Kate hanging on the wall. The girl blushed as she looked at Jai Jixu. A slight smile appeared on her face. She was hanging from the wall with her jagged weapon. Kate thought that this power is the cherished dream of all hunters, and Jai Jixu might be able to open up a whole new world for hunters. The girl pulled the weapon out of the wall and began to gradually go down. She thought that this was all thanks to the help of that man, the guest on 23rd Street. She wondered who he was and what his goal was. Max flew up to her from the right side and ordered her to stop thinking so much. The 2 of them flew down. The guy had his kunai in his hand. Max said that they only need to accompany and then share the glory. It is her duty. Kate's hair fluttered beautifully in the air. The girl said that the guy was right. Max had already landed while Kate was just approaching the road. The guy said that we need to continue the battle. Their enemies pointed their staves and cast a flame spell before activating the fire. The flames rushed towards Jai Jixu despite the rain. A bright light flashed and explosions sounded as the wolf tried to move back. Jai Jixu's snow-white fur began to slowly smoke. She bared her teeth, showing her sharp fangs. There was another explosion in the Gothic tower. Jai Jixu's fur turned a dirty gray shade. She opened her mouth and stuck out her tongue. The huge yellow eye began to emit lightning that surrounded the wolf. The rounded end of one of the magician's staff continued to sparkle just as brightly. The enemies did not stop their fiery attack for a second. Jai Jixu clenched her fangs and frowned at them. Max pierced one of their enemies with a kunai. Kate looked the other way. Another explosion sounded in the direction of Jai Jixu. Kate called out to her in concern. On the other side, on the roof, several people stood. Helix turned to Yuan and told him that someone was helping Jai Jixu. These 2 people stood in light robes. Helix with a golden brooch on his neck said that he did not know that there was such a person with transformation control in Nazen. Even Frank Wild could not do anything against it. He asked Yuan if he had met Frank Wild. Helix said that the man from the secret tower told them that he once appeared on 23rd Street. Yuan had a scar on his right eye and a piercing on his lower lip. He responded negatively to his ally. Helix told him to go and meet him. He is his teacher after all. At this time, behind them, Jai Jixu was tearing apart the protective field. The man with scars on his lips turned around sharply when he realized this. The she-wolf was already preparing to attack them. The man thought that he had not noticed this. The dream beast is the wolf form of the famous time traveler. More importantly, he didn't understand how she knew his location for the interdimensional jump. Jai Jixu knocked him onto his back while they were on the roof. She bit into her enemy's hand, blood spraying in all directions. Helix, in panic and fear, began to call his partner Yuan. Yuan himself was thrown to the side and slid along the wet road. He opened his mouth wide to cast a spell for the dizziness and flickering technique. The fur on Jai-Jixu's back stood on end as she thought that he had released such a powerful spell using such a refined tongue. This is a technique appropriate to enlightened dark magicians. The she-wolf lowered her gaze, realizing that everything was bad and she could not move. Helix walked up to the immobilized Jai-Jixu and grabbed her paw. In his other hand he had a dagger, which he was about to plunge into her head. Jai-Jixu suddenly opened her eyes and bared her teeth, then used her will of steel. With this, she was able to break free of the grip and regain control of her body. The she-wolf tore off Helix's right arm. He clenched his teeth. Suddenly, a black and purple glow appeared in front of Jai-Jixu. Yuan raised his staff into the air, where there was a black liquid with tentacles. This was the manifestation of a flame spell called Rotting Sun that Yuan cast. The dark force spread around. Jai-Jixu understood that it was extremely dangerous and she could die. She believed that she should run away quickly. Even though her body was deformed, she used force jump. The image of the wolf began to evaporate right into the air. Scarlet blood poured out of her mouth. Yuan ran up to Helix lying on the road and asked if he was okay. He sat down with difficulty and replied that he was fine. Helix said that the guy from 23rd Street might be stronger than they thought. The man immediately grew his left arm. Yuan looked at him with fear. He asked if her power was really the ability to move through time and space. Helix grew 2 whole right arms. He responded negatively. He tore off his extra hand and said that he was talking about how she could use Ryan's soul to obtain his intelligence network, because she secretly found out their exact location and even dispelled the spells associated with Yuan's soul. Yuan's gaze became confused and even a little angry. He said he was increasingly interested in this power. Helix extended his hand and replied that he had a lot of unfinished business. He asked Yuan to look at his palm and said that this was more important than Frank Wild. In his hand was a dark ball of energy in the shape of an egg with electricity inside. Helix's face became crazy and he asked Yuan what would hatch from this egg. The man looked at him a little scared and replied that it would be a beast from dreams. Helix opened his eyes wide and said that he was wrong. He replied that a deity would appear, a real god, imagining in his head sharp fangs with red lips. The main character closed the front door to the store. A stack of 4 books sat on the table next to a pen and ink. Lin Jai began to walk up the stairs. He went up to the 2nd floor and scratched his head, saying that he didn't know how long it would stop raining. He decided to wait until the end of the rain and then go shopping for household goods. The main character grabbed the door handle, pushing it forward. The guy entered his bedroom with a large bed. He nailed the nail to the wall with a hammer. He hung the dream catcher on this nail and sat down on the bed. Lin Jai thought that Frank Wild's handicraft is truly quite good, and even if you don't take into account the meaning of wish put into it, this dream catcher itself is an incomparable product. The main character smiled and lowered his eyebrows. The gargoyle was also incomparable. Frank Wild is really very skillful. The guy decided to talk to him about it the next time he comes. Lin Jai yawned loudly, tears flowing from his eyes due to reflex. He lay down on his bed and covered himself with the blanket, hoping the dream catcher would work. He wished himself good night and good dreams. His brown eyes were slightly open. Within a second his eyelids began to grow heavy, after which he closed his eyes. The dream catcher was covered with fluorescent paint that glowed in the dark. The feathers of the gift slowly moved as Lin Jai drifted off to sleep. The main character extended his hand forward, snow falling on his palm. He was wearing a white jacket and pants. The guy asked if he was in a dream. He walked barefoot along the snow-covered road. Lin Jai compared the falling snow to ash, but he didn't feel cold at all. On the contrary, he even felt a little warm. He stopped and looked in the other direction, thinking that this was all not surprising, because it was a dream. Suddenly he noticed something, which made his mouth open slightly. A breathtaking view of mountain slopes and a huge tree appeared before him. The main character froze in place and quietly whispered how beautiful it was around. He took an uncertain step forward through the crisp snow. Lin Jai raised his head, his gaze surprised. He stood in front of a huge tree, realizing that in reality there could not be such a gigantic tree that covers the sky and the sun. The tree wriggled like a snake, like blood vessels wrapping around a skeleton. Something caught the guy's attention again. He noticed long snow-white hair blowing in the wind. A beautiful elf in a white dress with white eyelashes leaned against a tree trunk. Her eyes were closed and her pink lips were parted. She wore a silver tiara on her head and a choker around her neck. Lin Jai froze in amazement as snow fell from the sky in flakes. At that moment, a fragment of a melody that he had heard somewhere suddenly surfaced in Lin Jai's heart. A beautiful elf in a long fluffy dress stood near the window. He seemed to be stretching out his hands to her head, on which was a golden crown. Lin Jai lowered the corners of his lips and said that this is truly an incomparable landscape. He stretched out his hands to the white flower and said that this is a charming dream world, like a children's fairy tale. Frank Wilde did not deceive him. The main character picked a flower and took hold of its stem. He noted the simple yet sophisticated and refreshing aroma. He brought the flower to his face, opening his mouth slightly. With a slight smile on his face, he inhaled the sweet scent of the flower. With a happy face, he looked at the beautiful plant, thinking that this flower could not be real. He said that this is a lucid dream. Lin Jai stood near a tree with fireflies flying around it. The main character thought that in this state a person in a dream is able to think vividly, remember and even distinguish his feelings from reality. Holding a flower in his left hand, he placed his right hand on his hip and raised his head. Lin Jai decided that the dream catcher had some psychological properties, which, together with Frank Wilde's interesting speech, created this dream. This explanation is very scientific, logical and romantic, consistent with Lin Jai. He looked more closely at the flower, frowning slightly. He wondered if he could do whatever he wanted since this was his dream. The main character looked towards the sleeping elf with shining eyes. He shyly closed one eye, trying to remember to respect the boundaries of what is permitted even in his sleep. However, he was still curious as to why he dreamed of such a beautiful girl. Lin Jai looked at the graceful curves of the elf and realized that people in dreams could not have such an exact appearance and at the same time be completely unfamiliar. He closed his eyes and put his fist to his chin. This white hair that all Chinese people like is very recognizable. The main character looked at the fancifully writhing tree, realizing that this was just a dream, which means anything could happen. Lin Jai walked up to the sleeping girl and decided to look at the man from the dreams to see what he would be like. The girl's white hair and eyelashes seemed to merge with the snow falling from the sky. The main character blushed deeply. His heart was beating very quickly and loudly. He described this girl as attractive, just like a perfect work of art, like the Venus de Milo, filled with divinely unreal sophistication. He picked up the flower again and smiled, closing his eyes, and said that since it was all in a dream, then let her allow him to be a little impudent. Lin Jai attached a flower to the elf's hair. He interpreted this as an offering to the charming patroness, although she herself is as beautiful as a flower. The guy stroked her on the top of her head and ran his hands through the snow-white lock of hair. He blushed a little from embarrassment and scratched his cheek, closing his eyes. These kinds of boundary violations and unclear actions worried him a little. But since everything is in a dream, then nothing will happen. He opened one eye slightly, as if he was afraid of something. The girl opened her eyes, which were purple. Lin Jai was scared and took a step back, afraid that he had disturbed her. Suddenly the girl stood up and walked straight. She closed her eyes as her clothes began to gradually transform. Lin Jai looked at the girl in shock and realized that this could not be seen in a lying position. But this person from the dream was at least 2 meters tall. He reminded himself again that this was a dream. The girl's large purple eyes opened wide, framed by white eyelashes. Alphika was now dressed in a white and pink dress. She straightened the flower on her head and asked the main character who he was. The main character tensed and was surprised that she suddenly asked the question first. He frowned a little, slight wrinkles appearing under his eyes. He remembered that people met in a dream are often the embodiment of the subconscious, and dialogue with them is a very rare experience. He extended his hand to the girl and replied that he was a man from a dream. The elf closed one eye and blushed a little. She said that she was in a dream. Of course she was a person from a dream. They stood and looked at each other for a while. Lin Jai was surprised that she knew she was in a dream. She never ceased to impress him. Such a mystical projection of the subconscious was truly worthy of his sleep. He pointed his finger at her and said that at least this answer was true. The elf looked slightly confused. Her mouth was slightly open. The main character said that it was his turn to ask a question. He asked who she was and noted that the answer of a person from a dream was not accepted. Lin Jai was a little embarrassed. He closed his eyes and sighed. Because it's all a dream, he feels like he's exposed a little bit of his cheeky nature. The girl's cheeks turned a little red and she smiled slightly. She looked at Lin Jai sincerely and said that her name was Bayan, which translated to silver. The main character tensed a little, but still looked calm. He asked if she only said her name. Bayan winked and raised her index finger up, and repeated Lin Jai's phrase that at least this answer was truthful. The girl began to approach the main character, her hair flying in the air and her chest shaking a little. This made the main character take aback and start backing away. Bayan said that it was her turn to ask the question. Her breasts were at the level of Lin Jai's face. He tried to look away, but still nothing could hide his embarrassment. He thought that her smile was too deadly. Baein closed her eyes, lowering her white fluffy eyelashes. She pointed her finger at the snow-capped mountains and said that she had been here for a very long time. So long ago that she had already forgotten what time was. The girl turned her head slightly to the side and put her left hand on her chest. Baein looked at the falling snow and cloudy sky, saying that it was certainly beautiful here, but she always had the feeling that it was too quiet. Eternal silence, like death. She looked at Lin Jai a little confused and asked if he could tell her what this feeling was. The main character looked at her thoughtfully, putting his hand to his chin. He smiled and frowned a little, thinking about how lonely it might be. Lin Jai wondered if he could also expand his business in his sleep. The corners of his lips turned up, and he wondered if this dream was too much in line with his preferences. He presented Baein surrounded by many beautiful and fresh flowers. On this romantic, fairy tale hill with irises, he uses his best work to help this pleasant and graceful lady get out of her impasse. His cheeks turned a little red, and even in his sleep he began to daydream and think that this was just a daily relaxing hobby that he couldn't give up. Baein looked at him in surprise. He decided to adhere to the rule of helping others and pleasing himself because his ancestors would not deceive him. Lin Jai looked at his white pajamas and thought that they looked very casual. He was just thinking that it would be nice to have his everyday outfit, when suddenly his clothes began to rustle and transform. Within a moment, the main character was dressed in his usual black formal suit. Since this is a lucid dream, he can, to some extent, change reality with his imagination. Lin Jai looked at his hands covered with gloves with a slight smile on his face. Since this is not real, then there is no need to be so careful. He put his hand under the falling snow. The main character extended his hand to Baein and smiled. He asked if she wanted to sit down and talk if she didn't mind. The girl smiled very sweetly, although she didn't answer anything. Baein opened her mouth slightly and began to extend her hand in response. She began to place her palm on top of Lin Jai's palm. He was a little embarrassed and blushed when she did this. He felt cool and soft from this touch. The main character decided to first find out the situation. They sat down together on a soft flower field. Lin Jai put his hands on his knee and asked if Baein was always alone in this dream world. She narrowed her pink eyes a little and replied that no one had ever entered here and could not enter. The pink and white dress covered her legs a little, although it exposed the girl's knees. She placed her hand on her chest and sincerely replied that Lin Jai was the first to set foot here. Lin Jai felt slightly tense because of Baein's attractiveness. He thought that she was like a princess from a fairy tale. They were completely alone, sitting in a field of iris. For a long time, living in a beautiful flower garden, she was always alone. Eternal sleep is her life. Lin Jai believed that he really was in a fairy tale. He lowered his gaze sadly, regretting that this was just a dream after all, and even after understanding her problem, there was no way he could truly help Baein. The main character lowered his gaze a little and said that the feelings that arose in the girl were a lack of communication and loneliness. Baein opened her mouth a little and silently looked at the guy. Lin Jai turned to her and calmly explained that the lack of communication appeared because she was always alone, and he could understand her, and the loneliness was due to the lack of new impressions and concentration in thoughts. The more she thinks about it, the more painful it becomes. A lot of people do. Baein placed her right hand on her chest and lowered her eyes. She said that thoughts are the source of pain. They cannot understand it because they are afraid. Lin Jai lowered his head and put his hand to his chin. He realized that the reason was in thoughts and misunderstanding. From the very beginning there was a philosopher in her image. In this case, the main character decided to immediately get down to business. He put his finger to his lips and said that he once heard the phrase. Lin Jai winked at the girl, raising his finger, and said that when people think, God laughs. The main character smiled and raised his hand, saying that they would not delve into the original meaning of this phrase. He looked at the embarrassed Baein, who was straightening her hair, and said that if God saw the thoughts of such an extraordinary beauty, the smile he would show would surely be warm. The girl opened her eyes wide and her cheeks turned deep red. Lin Jai lowered his head and closed his eyes. He said that with such a thought, it won't hurt so much to think, and there is a little mutual understanding with God without words. He opened his heavy eyelids slightly. After this, the main character laughed and asked if she thought such a thought was too romantic. Baein rested her hands on the ground and turned her head away. She replied that this kind of thinking was really like something a romantic would say. Lin Jai put his hand behind his head and blushed a little, answering that he was an incorrigible romantic at heart. He immediately calmed down and put on a normal face, saying that this was probably how he could talk to her here. Baein sat with her back to him, her hair blowing in a light cool wind. She said that the fact that he appeared in this dream already means that he understands her and is on the same level with her. Perhaps his thoughts become more sublime. This made Lin Jai feel a little trembling. She smiled and thought that philosophers praise people like this. It is very comfortable to listen to. A slight blush still on his cheeks, he replied that she recognized him. He grabbed the girl's hand with both hands. He said that he was taking the liberty of asking her. Baein was very embarrassed and even confused by such a gesture. Lin Jai said that this was his most urgent desire, and he hoped that she would agree. The girl's cheeks were deeply red, and sweat was running down her face. She asked to make this request. The main character was very worried. He began his speech. He was full of confidence, even though he was nervous. Holding her hand, he asked her to be his friend. Baein looked at him with a look of complete misunderstanding. Lin Jai thought that when faced with a person who tends to withdraw into himself, it is better not to give the initiative to his partner. The corners of his lips turned up a little, and a bead of sweat ran down his cheek. He believed that due to the inertia of her thinking, she would undoubtedly subconsciously refuse immediately. The main character made eye contact with the girl while holding her hands. He decided that he needed to stop her from refusing. Baein looked puzzled and a little confused. She hesitantly asked about her friend. Lin Jai let go of her hands and answered in the affirmative. Fireflies and green leaves were in the air. He said that although it was beautiful here, if she constantly looked at the same landscapes, sooner or later she would get bored. The main character asked if she had tried to make a friend, because doing everyday things together is much more fun than alone. When he talks about sharing, he immediately thinks about recommendations, and when he talks about recommendations, he immediately thinks about book promotion. His eyes sparkled and his mouth broke into a wide smile. When it comes down to it, these two books are simply inhuman. Lin Jai frowned and fell silent for a while. Although it is not in the store, as before, it should be possible to restore the book from memory. A collection of Brothers Grimm fairy tales appeared on his knee. He silently leafed through the book, page by page. After that, he quietly closed the book with fairy tales. The main character smiled and handed the fairy tales to the girl, saying that she could consider this a gift from a friend upon their first meeting. Baein's face was in shadow, but the light shining through the foliage fell on her face. With both hands, Lin Jai handed the book to the girl. She offered her hands. Baein hugged the book to her chest and smiled. She said that no one had given her gifts for a long time and there had been no people wanting to talk to her for a long time. She lowered one hand down. Baein stood up, her long hair writhing. She said she had nothing. But after that, the girl looked into Lin Jai's eyes and said that if he wished, he could take the fruits on the tree and the honey and the flowers as her return gift. Lin Jai turned around and looked up, looking at the tree. There were golden fruits hanging among the green leaves on the branches of the tree, which Lin Jai did not immediately notice. The main character began to stretch his left hand upward. With his other hand he felt the iris growing here. He thought that there was nothing special about flowers either. A unique experience still needed a few rare things. Lin Jai turned to Baein and asked her if he could eat the fruit right away. The girl smiled softly and closed her eyes, answering in the affirmative. She pointed her finger at the fruits of the old tree. At that same second, a fruit that looked like an apple fell right into Lin Jai's hands. The fruit had a small branch with a leaf, and the fruit itself was golden in color. The main character thought that the realization corresponded to the dream, so perfect, as if in a picture. A drop of saliva began to flow down the guy's lips. He was wondering what the fruit tasted like. He opened his mouth wide and brought the apple there. He began to chew the fruit with a thoughtful face. It was a crunchy and sweet seedless fruit, not very different from an apple. The taste was taken from reality. Baein looked at him with a calm face and asked how he tasted. Lin Jai smiled and closed his eyes. He replied that the fruit is very sweet. Suddenly everything around began to shake and blur. The surroundings have already begun to change colors and crack. The main character realized that he was starting to wake up. It seemed to him that it came too quickly. It didn't feel like much time had passed. He looked at his gloved hand and realized that the sense of touch in the world again had no value either. Lin Jai extended his hand to Baein and said that although he didn't really want to, he had to go. The girl put her hand in the guy's hand without saying anything. She suddenly grabbed the guy by the neck, greatly embarrassing him. The main character looked at her dumbfounded, not understanding what she wanted to do. Baein bit Lin Jai's earlobe and pressed her lips together. She pulled away and looked playfully at the guy. The guy was very embarrassed, but tried not to show it. Finally, she said that she hoped that they would meet again. Baein was left alone next to a tall tree in a field of flowers. Yuan lit the cigarette with magic. He was smoking in the alley, despite the pouring rain. He said choosing Helix was the wrong move. Yuan took the cigarette in his hands and exhaled the acrid smoke, saying that choosing someone else would be even more wrong. He looked straight, showing his scar on his right eye. He said that he, who crippled his brothers and betrayed his teacher, did not have any special options from the very beginning. While Yuan was standing near the wall, his interlocutor spoke. He said subordinates overstep their boundaries without knowing what's so special about the task. The interlocutor asked if he needed a person who, even after being wounded, would take responsibility. Yuan frowned a little and was silent for a while. He said that Miss Jai-Jitsu had become strangely stronger not long ago. Even she and Helix were about to engage in a fierce battle. He introduced Jai-Jitsu as she transformed into a werewolf. According to Yuan, Frank Wilde, even after being mortally wounded, did not die by luck, but he should have lived away from the world along with his pride. He introduced Frank Wilde, who lowered his head and closed his eyes. Recently, it was reported that he had been spotted again, and his power seemed even more terrifying than before. Yuan's right arm was bandaged and secured in a bent position. He raised his head and said that Jai-Jitsu and Frank Wilde were both related to the owner of the bookstore on 23rd Street. He felt as if their fate had been rewritten there. He flicked the ash off a burning cigarette and asked his interlocutor if he remembered his task. The shadow from the wall began to separate. A voice from there said that he remembered everything. The separated shadow looked at Yuan and said that in order to scout out the situation of the bookstore and the condition of its owner, one would need the opponent's level and appearance, as well as the general layout and location of the bookstore. Yuan looked down at him and asked him with a creepy grin if he could bring him good news. A green eye flashed near the shadow in the darkness. He ran lightning fast through the streets of Nazan while it was raining. Yuan held a smoking cigarette in his left hand. He said that faceless man with black scales became even stronger and appeared again. He was afraid that even the authors of horror novels would not dare to easily accept this exaggerated setting. He took the cigarette into his mouth and inhaled tobacco smoke into his lungs. Yuan hoped that the intelligence was wrong. A mysterious man, who was only visible in silhouette, arrived at the Lin Jai bookstore, which was located on 23rd Street at number 412. A man with thick brown hair and a slight stubble on his face was sticking half out of the cobblestone road and said that apparently he arrived at the destination. His name was John. He turned into a shapeless shadow again and crawled through the cracks in the front doors. He slowly crawled into the store, where it was dark and quiet. The light from the full moon fell on the wooden floor. John looked up, looking at the many bookshelves. He did not feel any vibrations of the ether, and if we speak based on sensations, then this is just an ordinary bookstore. He walked past the table with the gargoyle and headed towards the stairs, thinking that his superiors had made a mistake. Just in case, John decided to inspect the second floor once. The gargoyle statue opened one of its eyes, which was red. Within a second, the gargoyle's eye was closed. John stood in front of Lin Jai's bedroom door. Only he did not check this room. This is the only place where there are signs of life. The breathing seems to be quite normal. It doesn't look like it's someone extraordinary. He slowly began to rise to his full height, crawling out of the shadows. John said that in the end he was unnecessarily nervous. He didn't even think that it would be such a simple task. The man felt that Mr. Yuan was too worried. He furrowed his brows and grinned evilly, because he believed that there could not be monsters in a shabby bookstore. John thought that this time he would kill the owner of the bookstore at the same time and then return with a report. He presented the report in such a way that he would say that in fact the one they were worried about was nothing more than an ordinary person who had already fallen at his hands. The man extended his hands to the round doorknob. He grabbed the door handle and immediately turned it. John thought the expressions on his boss's faces when they listened would be so funny. Entering the bedroom, he was surprised. There was a bed in the middle of the room where Lin Jai slept. Above the bed hung a glowing dream catcher with 3 circles. However, what was more surprising was that the entire room was strewn with blue flowers, and red tree roots wriggled among them. John's yellow eyes opened wide in shock. Lin Jai slept peacefully on his back with his hands clasped together while he was surrounded by beautiful flowers and tree roots. Flowers with blue petals seemed to have sprouted from red roots. The room was completely covered with them. Even the ceiling was overgrown with roots and flowers. The man felt that something was wrong here. A drop of sweat ran down his cheek. Suddenly, the roots grabbed John by the arms and legs, and an eyeball with a yellow iris fell to the floor. He began to shake and moved unnaturally. Suddenly, John's body began to deform, as if growths appeared on his back. He left the room, closing the door behind him with the doorknob. He began to walk down the stairs, his eye remaining on the floor in the hallway. John moved his legs with difficulty as he walked down the stairs. He muttered something unintelligible. Blood flowed down his face, hidden in shadow. He said that he must get rid of everything that would threaten the owner's existence. Tears were flowing from his remaining eye and drool was flowing from his mouth. The empty eye socket was bleeding. John looked insane. He addressed himself to a certain master, calling himself a slave who had arrived to serve him faithfully. Yuan was still standing in the alley smoking a cigarette. He said that half an hour had passed. According to him, given the effectiveness of John, this kind of non-combat mission did take quite a long time. He looked at the green watch on his left wrist. Yuan thought that this bookstore was indeed not simple, and the decision not to go himself out of caution was the right one. He raised his head and exhaled thick cigarette smoke. In his opinion, everything is not so bad, and if something happened, you can escape without any problems using John's abilities. He imagined his evil face and silhouette, thinking that half of the shadow moss worm blood was still circulating in his body. The shadow transformation technique was capable of manifesting 200%. For John, blending into the shadows, holding his breath to escape unnoticed should be as easy as returning home. Yuan threw away his smoked and crumpled cigarette. The cigarette butt fell into a puddle near the grass growing near the wall. The man took a new cigarette out of the pack and put it in his mouth. He thought that given the attention he was getting, he would complete the task himself as soon as John returned. Suddenly his face became surprised and puzzled. He looked to his right and began to sweat from exertion. Obviously, the cigarette was not lit. In the rain, in this pitch-black alley, he saw his shadow. Yuan immediately realized that something was wrong. He threw away his pack of cigarettes and lit it with a flame spell called Blazing Earth. A pack of cigarettes hit an object flying from above. An explosion sounded in the air, causing a bright flash to appear. Yuan pulled off his cloak and thought that the current situation was too unfavorable for him. The rainy day had weakened all the power of his fire spells. He needed to retreat as soon as possible. Although he did not know why John became a traitor, he believed that now beyond any doubt he would die. The man frowned and cast the flame spell again, burning the ground. John appeared from the shadows, standing near the wall. He started attacking Yuan with his shadows. One of the shadow strikes pierced Yuan's arm and pinned him to the wall. A second later, the shadow turned into a pitchfork, causing the hand to start bleeding. Yuan opened his mouth wide and screamed shrilly. He plunged John into the flames until he could not move. He used a heating technique and melted the pitchfork stuck in his hand. Yuan sat down on one knee and said that he was much more skilled at betrayal than John. He said it was stupid and naive to think he wouldn't be on guard. He pointed his hand towards the burning John and said that this was the end. Chunks of flesh were torn from John's body as he burned. 2 burning pieces of meat fell onto the tiled road. Something made Yuan alert and stop. He sweated profusely and was in shock, not understanding what was happening. The skeleton's huge jaw began to spew flames at Yuan. The man was horrified, looking at the monster, and said that it was not John. He asked who he was. The big white teeth began to move. A monstrous creature resembling a skeleton with hair appeared in front of Yuan. The monster turned to his master and said that his servant would remove the obstacles. Yuan grabbed his wounded hand and remembered that John was an unbeliever. The man raised his head in horror and realized that this was a warning from the owner of the bookstore. Someone knocked on Helix's door in the White Wolf's office. There was a bright green light in the office. Helix allowed his subordinate to enter and asked what happened. A subordinate reported that Yuan had died. Helix turned around in shock and asked in a trembling voice what happened. The servant himself was very nervous. His whole face was covered with sweat. He said he had photographs of the scene. The subordinate took out a tablet on which information was attached. He said that there is an examination of spell traces, which are on-site restoration reports made by the black magicians of the Red Religion. Helix looked gloomily at the documents from the scene. Suddenly his pupil constricted as he saw something. A photo of the alley Yuan was in appeared in front of him, but there were the same roots and flowers as in Lin Jai's room. The subordinate said that on Helix's orders, Mr. Yuan sent a person to scout the bookstore, and as a result, after returning, the sent person unexpectedly rebelled, killing Mr. Yuan. The photographs showed the mutilated body of a man with torn clothes. The second photo was of his face with his mouth open, and a flower growing out of it. Next, the subordinate showed a photo, which Yui tried his best to convey. There was a picture of a bloody hand and an inscription written in blood. The sign on the road was in order to run. Helix took this document and took it out of the tablet. He realized that John, who had returned from the bookstore, was parasitized by an unknown creature, changing his mind, and even dark magicians could not find out what kind of creature it was. Helix frowned and bared his teeth, asking what they were going to do next. The servant was very worried and nervous. He replied that the dark magicians were going to transfer the Red Religion to the general staff, allowing the praying Murphy to decide. They suggested that they scrap the idea of scouting the bookstore and ensure that the magic mirror egg hatched first. Helix frowned as he thought about the destructive level red religion still not showing its face. The man stood with his back to the employee and ordered to inform them that the White Wolf would make every effort to cooperate. The subordinate bowed and accepted the order. The door to the office closed. Helix stood facing the window with a green light. He clenched his hands into fists and turned his head away. The man wondered if this could be a warning from the owner of the bookstore. He didn't expect the method to be so terrifying. Outside the window there was a laboratory with a large capsule. Now an important stage of incubation of the magic mirror egg is taking place. Helix believed in keeping things simple. He placed his fist against the glass behind which the egg was located. He frowned and bared his teeth angrily, saying that no matter what the owner of the bookstore was, Helix would never allow any uncertainty to interfere with his plans.